The Unbroken Reich, What If Germany Had Won World War I? Written by Marcus Drayson, narrated by Gloria Feathers. Chapter 1: The Great War's Turning Point. As World War I raged across Europe, 1917 emerged as the critical year that could have determined the war's ultimate outcome. In our reality, the entry of the United States and the crumbling of the Eastern Front led to Germany's eventual defeat. But what if events had unfolded differently? A few pivotal moments could have swung the war in Germany's favor, altering the course of history entirely. One of the most significant factors was the failure of the German spring offensives in 1918. If these attacks had broken through Allied lines, Germany might have forced Britain and France to negotiate peace before American troops arrived in full strength. The Germans, under General Ludendorff, came close to achieving this, but logistical challenges and the resilience of the Allies ultimately led to exhaustion on the German side. Had Germany secured victory on the Western Front in early 1918, a new Europe could have emerged under German dominance. Another key element was the Russian Revolution. With the fall of the Tsar and the rise of the Bolsheviks, Russia exited the war, allowing Germany to shift troops westward. However, if Germany had been able to negotiate a more favorable peace with Russia earlier, perhaps by supporting a less radical government, it could have stabilized the Eastern Front sooner, securing vital resources and preventing the chaotic collapse that followed. A stable Russian ally or puppet state could have relieved Germany's strategic burden and ensured long-term control over Eastern Europe. The United States' role was another turning point. Initially, President Wilson maintained a stance of neutrality, but unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram drew America into the war. If Germany had avoided provoking the U.S., or if public opinion in America had leaned toward isolationism, the war might have dragged on without the overwhelming American intervention that tipped the balance. Without U.S. support, Britain and France might have struggled to hold their lines, potentially forcing them to seek an armistice on Germany's terms. Economic strain also played a role in Germany's eventual defeat. The British naval blockade cut off crucial supplies, starving Germany's war effort. If Germany had broken the blockade with a successful naval campaign or had gained access to new resources through alliances or occupied territories, it could have sustained its war effort longer. A well-supplied Germany in 1918 could have outlasted the Allies in a prolonged war of attrition. These alternate scenarios highlight the fragile nature of victory and defeat in war. With just a few different decisions or strokes of luck, Germany could have emerged as the dominant power of the 20th century, reshaping global history in ways almost unimaginable today. Key battles that could have changed history. Throughout World War I, several battles stood at the crossroads of victory and defeat. Had they unfolded differently, the war's outcome and the world that followed might have taken an entirely new course. A few decisive moments could have tipped the balance in Germany's favor, reshaping the future of Europe and beyond. One such battle was the First Battle of the Marne in 1914. The German Schlieffen Plan aimed to swiftly defeat France before turning east to deal with Russia. German forces advanced deep into French territory, coming dangerously close to Paris. However, a last-minute French counteroffensive, aided by British troops, halted the German advance. If Germany had broken through, Paris might have fallen, forcing France to surrender early. With France out of the war, Britain would have faced immense pressure to negotiate, and Germany could have focused all its strength on Russia, potentially securing a quick and decisive victory. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 also played a critical role. The German High Command sought to bleed France white by launching a massive assault on the fortress city of Verdun. The French, under General Pétain, mounted a tenacious defense, turning Verdun into a symbol of national resilience. Germany suffered heavy losses and failed to break French resistance. However, had Germany overrun Verdun and pushed deeper into French lines, the psychological and strategic blow might have crippled French morale, leading to a political crisis and possible surrender. In 1918, the German Spring Offensive nearly altered the war's course. With Russia out of the war following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany transferred massive numbers of troops to the Western Front. In a desperate bid to end the war before American reinforcements arrived in full force, the Germans launched a series of powerful offensives. They made significant gains, breaking through Allied lines and reaching within striking distance of Paris. However, logistical struggles, exhausted troops, and coordinated Allied counterattacks ultimately stopped them. If Germany had successfully captured key Allied positions and forced Britain and France into peace negotiations, the war could have ended on German terms before the United States had a decisive impact. Another pivotal battle was the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the largest naval engagement of the war. The German High Seas Fleet clashed with the British Royal Navy, hoping to break Britain's naval supremacy and force a change in the blockade that was strangling Germany. While the battle ended in a tactical stalemate, Britain maintained control of the seas. If Germany had won decisively, it might have disrupted British supply lines and pressured Britain to withdraw, altering the entire strategic landscape. These battles highlight the razor-thin margins of victory and defeat in World War I. If events had played out differently, Germany could have secured dominance in Europe, forever changing the course of history. The American decision, neutrality, or intervention. At the outset of World War I, the United States remained neutral, reluctant to involve itself in a conflict seen as a European struggle. President Woodrow Wilson championed this neutrality, believing that America should act as a mediator rather than a participant. For nearly 3 years, the U.S. maintained this stance, despite growing economic and political pressures. However, a series of events ultimately drew America into the war, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. If the U.S. had remained neutral, Germany might have secured victory, reshaping the global order. One of the most critical factors influencing America's decision was unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany's use of U-boats to target Allied and neutral shipping, including American vessels, angered the U.S. public and government. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which resulted in the deaths of 128 Americans, caused outrage but did not immediately lead to war. Germany temporarily restricted its submarine campaign, fearing U.S. involvement, but by 1917, it resumed unrestricted attacks, believing it could starve Britain into surrender before America could intervene. This gamble backfired as it pushed the U.S. toward war. Another turning point was the infamous Zimmermann telegram. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from Germany to Mexico, proposing an alliance in which Mexico would reclaim lost territories in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined the war against the U.S. When the telegram was made public, it further inflamed American sentiment against Germany. Wilson, who had sought to keep the U.S. out of the war, now faced mounting pressure to respond. Economic interests also played a role. American banks and industries had loaned billions to Britain and France. A German victory could have jeopardized these investments, creating financial turmoil for the U.S. While economic concerns alone may not have driven America to war, they certainly influenced policymakers who feared the consequences of an Allied defeat. Had the United States remained neutral, the war might have ended very differently. Without the influx of American troops, weapons, and resources, Britain and France would have struggled to withstand Germany's final offensives. A negotiated peace, rather than an outright Allied victory, could have been the likely outcome, potentially leaving Germany in a dominant position in Europe. The American decision to intervene was one of the most decisive moments of the war. It not only ensured the defeat of Germany, but also marked the beginning of America's rise as a global power. Yet, if neutrality had prevailed, the world might have seen a very different 20th century, one in which Germany shaped the post-war order rather than the victorious Allies. The Russian Front and the fate the Bolsheviks. The Eastern Front of World War I was a theater of immense upheaval, not just militarily but politically. Russia entered the war as one of the Entente's great powers, but internal instability, economic collapse, and battlefield failures led to its withdrawal. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 transformed Russia's fate and altered the war's trajectory. Had events unfolded differently, Germany might have secured a stronger peace in the East, changing the course of history. By 1917, Russia was in crisis. Years of war had drained its resources, and morale among soldiers and civilians had collapsed. The February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, leading to the establishment of a provisional government. This new leadership, under Alexander Kerensky, vowed to continue fighting, but its authority was weak. Soldiers deserted in droves, and radical factions gained influence. Germany recognized this instability and saw an opportunity to remove Russia from the war. One of the most decisive moves was Germany's role in facilitating Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia. In April 1917, German authorities transported Lenin from exile in Switzerland to Petrograd, hoping his revolutionary ideology would destabilize the Russian government. The strategy worked. By November, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, overthrowing the provisional government in the October Revolution. With their rise, peace negotiations with Germany became inevitable. In March 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk formally ended Russia's involvement in the war. The treaty was a major victory for Germany, granting it vast territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. These lands provided valuable resources and strategic depth, allowing Germany to concentrate its forces on the Western Front. However, the harsh terms of the treaty also fueled resentment among Russians and contributed to the outbreak of the Russian Civil War. If Russia had remained in the war under a different government, Germany's position might have been far weaker. A stable Russian state, whether under the Tsar or Kerensky, could have continued fighting, preventing Germany from shifting troops westward. Alternatively, if the Bolsheviks had failed to consolidate power, Germany might have faced a prolonged conflict in the East, draining its resources further. The fate of the Bolsheviks was closely tied to Germany's victory in the East. In an alternate scenario where Germany had won the war, it is possible the Bolshevik regime would not have survived. A victorious Germany might have supported anti-communist forces in Russia, preventing the Soviet Union from ever forming. Without Bolshevik rule, the ideological struggles of the 20th century, including the Cold War, might never have taken shape. The Russian front was more than just a battlefield. It was a catalyst for one of the most significant political upheavals in history. Germany's influence on Russia's fate was undeniable, and had the war ended differently, the global balance of power in the 20th century could have been unrecognizable. Chapter 2: A Victorious Germany's Peace. If Germany had emerged victorious in World War I, the post-war world would have looked dramatically different. Instead of the Treaty of Versailles imposing harsh terms on Germany, it would have been Germany dictating the terms of peace to the defeated Allies. The foundations of Europe, and perhaps the entire global order, would have shifted under German dominance. Germany's victory likely would have come through a decisive breakthrough on the Western Front or a successful negotiation following prolonged attrition. In either case, the terms of peace would have heavily favored the Central Powers. France, having suffered enormous losses, would have been forced into submission. Germany might have demanded territorial concessions, economic reparations, or military restrictions on France to prevent it from challenging German supremacy in the future. The loss of key industrial regions such as Alsace-Lorraine could have weakened France permanently, ensuring its secondary status in Europe. Britain, although geographically protected by its navy, might have been compelled to negotiate. A peace settlement could have forced Britain to recognize German territorial acquisitions and dismantle its blockade, which had strangled Germany's economy during the war. While outright German control over British colonies would have been unlikely, a victorious Germany could have demanded commercial and strategic advantages, altering the balance of global trade. The fate of Eastern Europe would have been even more dramatic. With Russia already defeated and bound by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany and its ally Austria-Hungary would have controlled vast swathes of former Russian territory. Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states might have remained under German influence, either as puppet governments or outright annexations. The Bolsheviks, still consolidating power, would have faced immense pressure, and a victorious Germany might have backed anti-communist forces to prevent the spread of revolution. In the aftermath of victory, Germany would have cemented its position as Europe's dominant power. A German-led economic and political order might have emerged, reshaping the continent's alliances and rivalries. Without the punitive Treaty of Versailles, Germany would not have faced the economic devastation and social unrest that fueled extremist movements like the Nazis. Instead, a stable, powerful German empire might have overseen a different kind of 20th century, one where the tensions that led to World War II never materialized. The consequences of a victorious Germany extend far beyond Europe. The United States, having entered the war late, might have retreated into isolationism without the moral victory of defeating the Central Powers. The British and French colonial empires, weakened by defeat, might have crumbled earlier, accelerating decolonization under German oversight. The entire trajectory of global power might have shifted, creating an alternate history where German dominance shaped the modern world. The Treaty of London, a German-led settlement. With Germany victorious in World War I, the post-war settlement would have been dictated by Berlin rather than the Allied powers. Instead of the Treaty of Versailles, a German-led peace agreement, perhaps named the Treaty of London, could have reshaped Europe and beyond in favor of the Central Powers. This treaty would have ensured German dominance, secured territorial gains, and restructured international relations for decades to come. A victorious Germany would have sought to cripple its former enemies while maintaining stability under its leadership. France, having suffered massive losses, would have been forced to cede key territories. Alsace-Lorraine would remain German, while additional French border regions might have been annexed or demilitarized to prevent future conflicts. Harsh economic penalties could have been imposed, limiting French military power and ensuring its dependency on German goodwill. Britain, despite its naval superiority, would have had little choice but to accept German terms. The treaty might have called for Britain to recognize Germany's dominance on the continent and dismantle its blockade. While Germany may not have sought direct control over British colonies, it could have negotiated trade agreements that favored its own economy, granting it privileged access to raw materials and markets across Africa and Asia. In Eastern Europe, the Treaty of London would have solidified Germany's influence. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had already stripped Russia of vast territories, and a victorious Germany would have ensured that these gains remained intact. Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states would have remained under German control, either as protectorates or puppet states. Germany might have further supported anti-Bolshevik forces, preventing the Soviet Union from ever forming and keeping Russia weak and divided. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, as Germany's allies, would have been rewarded. Austria-Hungary could have retained its influence over the Balkans, while the Ottoman Empire might have expanded its reach into the Caucasus and the Middle East. This restructuring would have prevented the rise of independent nations in those regions, extending the lifespan of these old empires under German oversight. Beyond Europe, the treaty could have reshaped global politics. Without an Allied victory, the United States might have withdrawn from international affairs, allowing Germany to set the tone for global diplomacy. The League of Nations, if formed at all, would have been built around German interests rather than Wilsonian ideals. The colonial world, instead of moving toward self-determination, might have seen German expansion, particularly in Africa, where Berlin had long sought a larger imperial presence. The Treaty of London would have marked the dawn of a German-led world order. With its former enemies weakened and its empire secure, Germany could have shaped the 20th century as the dominant force in global affairs, altering history in ways unimaginable under the actual course of events. The fate of France and Britain. A German victory in World War I would have left France and Britain in drastically weakened positions, forced to accept terms dictated by the Central Powers. Both nations, once the leading forces in European politics, would have faced territorial losses, economic subjugation, and diminished global influence under a German-led order. For France, defeat would have been devastating. Already exhausted by years of brutal warfare, its economy and military would have been shattered. Germany, seeking to prevent any future threat from its western neighbor, would have likely imposed harsh terms. Alsace-Lorraine, reclaimed by France in 1918 in our timeline, would have remained firmly under German control. Additional French territories, particularly industrial regions like northern France, might have been ceded to Germany or turned into demilitarized zones. With Paris humiliated, French nationalism and morale would have collapsed, making France a secondary power in European affairs. Germany's economic demands would have further weakened France. War reparations could have been enforced, draining French resources for decades. German occupation or oversight of key industries would have ensured that France remained dependent on Berlin's economic policies. The French military, once one of Europe's strongest, might have been severely restricted, preventing any resurgence of power. Political instability could have followed, with the possibility of German-backed leaders rising to power, or even internal unrest leading to radical shifts in governance. Britain, though geographically protected by the English Channel, would not have escaped the consequences of defeat. Its primary concern would have been the security of its vast colonial empire. A victorious Germany would not have sought direct control over British colonies, but would have demanded concessions in trade and influence. German expansion in Africa, long a goal of the Kaiser, might have been realized, forcing Britain to cede colonial territories or grant Germany preferential access to raw materials. The Royal Navy, once unchallenged, would have faced restrictions. Germany, eager to secure its global standing, might have imposed limitations on British naval power, ensuring that the German Navy could rival or even surpass it. The British economy, already strained by war, would have suffered under these new conditions, reducing its ability to project power worldwide. The long-term consequences for both nations would have been profound. France, weakened and dependent, might have fallen into political turmoil, possibly even revolution. Britain, no longer the undisputed global leader, could have seen its empire begin to erode much earlier. Meanwhile, Germany would have established itself as the dominant force in Europe, with both former Allied powers unable to challenge its supremacy. The 20th century, shaped by British and French influence in our reality, might have instead belonged to an unbroken German Reich. The end of the British Empire? A German victory in World War I would have marked the beginning of a new global order, one in which the British Empire's dominance would have been seriously threatened. While Germany may not have sought to dismantle the empire outright, its influence over global affairs and trade could have severely weakened Britain's grip on its colonies. The stability and power of the British Empire depended on its economic strength, naval superiority, and global prestige, all of which would have been shaken by defeat. One of the most immediate consequences would have been the loss of British influence over global trade. Germany, as the new dominant power in Europe, would have likely imposed economic terms that favored its own expansion while restricting Britain's access to key markets. The empire relied on a vast network of colonies for resources, but under German control, trade routes could have been disrupted, forcing Britain to make economic concessions that weakened its global standing. In Africa, Germany's ambitions for colonial expansion could have forced Britain to cede territories or allow greater German influence in regions like East Africa and the resource-rich Congo. With a victorious Germany pushing its interests, British colonial holdings might have become less secure, especially as nationalist movements gained momentum. India, the crown jewel of the British Empire, had already shown signs of unrest during the war. A weakened Britain, struggling to maintain control, could have faced stronger independence movements, possibly leading to an earlier decolonization process. Naval power was another critical factor in the survival of the empire. The Royal Navy had long been Britain's greatest strength, allowing it to project power across the world. A German-led peace settlement could have placed restrictions on Britain's naval capabilities, ensuring that the German Navy could challenge British dominance on the seas. Without unquestioned naval supremacy, Britain's ability to control distant colonies and enforce its authority would have been severely weakened. Political consequences at home would have further accelerated the decline of the empire. A defeat in the Great War could have led to widespread public discontent, eroding confidence in the government. Calls for reform or even revolution might have gained traction, leading to internal instability that made it harder to manage overseas territories. Without the morale boost of victory, Britain might have faced increased pressure from independence movements in Ireland, India, and beyond. While the British Empire may not have collapsed immediately, a German victory in World War I could have set in motion an irreversible decline. The empire, once the world's most powerful force, would have struggled to maintain its influence against a rising German Reich, potentially leading to a faster and more turbulent process of decolonization in the years that followed. Chapter 3: The New European Order. Following a German victory in World War I, the landscape of Europe would have been radically transformed, with Berlin at the center of a new political and economic order. The collapse of the old balance of power, characterized by the rivalry between the major European empires, would have given way to a Europe dominated by the Central Powers, particularly Germany and its allies. The ramifications of such a shift would have shaped not only the continent's future, but also the direction of global history for decades to come. Germany, as the undisputed victor, would have imposed its vision for the future of Europe through a peace settlement that would have permanently altered the political structure of the continent. The Treaty of London, or a similar agreement, would have cemented Germany's dominance, both militarily and economically. France, having been defeated and weakened, would have been relegated to a secondary position. Its borders could have been pushed back further, and it may have had to accept harsh terms such as territorial concessions, military restrictions, and economic reparations. Germany's goal would have been to prevent any future French revival and to ensure its own hegemony in Western Europe. Austria-Hungary, Germany's loyal ally, would have likely retained its influence over the Balkans and parts of Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Russian Empire had already opened the door for the Central Powers to consolidate their influence over these regions, and a victorious Germany would have ensured that the Austro-Hungarian Empire remained intact or expanded its territory. The creation of puppet states or protectorates across Eastern Europe could have extended German and Austro-Hungarian control over key regions, ensuring that no rival power could rise in the East. Italy, a late entrant to the war on the side of the Allies, would have been in a precarious position. While it might have gained some territorial concessions, the terms of peace would have been far less favorable than what it had hoped for by joining the Allied cause. As a result, Italy's ambitions in the Mediterranean might have been undermined by German influence, with the Central Powers taking control of key strategic areas. The new European order would have also witnessed the further entrenchment of authoritarian regimes. Germany, already a military dictatorship under the Kaiser, might have solidified its autocratic rule, and other Central Powers nations might have followed suit, rejecting democratic ideals. Nationalism and militarism would have been the driving forces behind this new Europe, and countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and the former Russian territories would have been left to navigate a continent reshaped by German control. This new order would have marked the start of a long period of German-dominated peace in Europe, one in which the political, social, and economic systems would be firmly structured to maintain German supremacy. While the traditional powers of France, Britain, and Russia would have been marginalized, a different kind of Europe would have emerged, one where the legacy of German victory would shape the continent's future for generations. Germany's dominance on the continent. A German victory in World War I would have led to the establishment of German dominance over Europe, with the Reich at the center of a new geopolitical and economic order. Having defeated its major rivals, Germany would have solidified its position as the undisputed power on the continent, reshaping not only the balance of power, but also the political, military, and economic landscape of Europe for decades to come. Germany's first and most immediate step would have been to secure its military superiority. With no significant challenge from France or Britain, both of whom would have been severely weakened, Germany would have been free to expand its military influence across Europe. The Treaty of London, or its equivalent, would likely have imposed terms that heavily favored German strategic interests, ensuring that no other power could rival its military might. With the Royal Navy severely curtailed and France's military resources depleted, Germany would have been the preeminent force, able to dictate the course of European affairs. In addition to military dominance, Germany would have sought to strengthen its economic position through territorial expansion and economic integration. The industrial heartlands of France and Belgium, along with vital regions in Eastern Europe, would likely have been brought under German control or heavily influenced. The annexation of key territories, such as the coal-rich regions of northern France, would have bolstered Germany's economic power and provided it with the resources necessary to maintain its military might. A tightly controlled trade network across Europe would have allowed Germany to dictate terms to other European nations, forcing them into economic dependencies. The German Empire's dominance would also have extended into the political sphere. The concept of Middle Europa, the idea of a Central European economic and political bloc under German leadership, would have become a reality. Germany would have sought to integrate its satellite states, such as Austria-Hungary and Poland, into this system, ensuring that they remained loyal to Berlin. In the Balkans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire would have been preserved or expanded, acting as a buffer zone for German interests. Countries like Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria could have been brought under German influence, either through direct control or political puppetry. With its power unchallenged, Germany would have had the ability to reshape Europe according to its vision. Nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism would have been the dominant political ideologies, with German leadership guiding the continent's development. The League of Nations, if it existed at all, would have been a German-dominated institution, sidelining the voices of France, Britain, and any other remaining powers. Germany's dominance on the continent would have marked a new era in European history, one in which the Reich would have been the driving force behind European politics, military strategy, and economic policy. The balance of power in Europe would have been forever altered, and the German Empire would have reshaped the continent to suit its own needs and ambitions. The fate of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. In the aftermath of a German victory in World War I, the fates of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would have been drastically altered. Both empires, which had struggled throughout the war, relied heavily on German support to secure their survival. With Germany victorious, these two central powers would have been in a unique position to reshape their futures, either through consolidation of power or through adaptation to the new European order dominated by Berlin. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic empire already facing internal divisions, would likely have been preserved or even expanded under German leadership. A victorious Germany eager to ensure stability in Central Europe would have seen the continuation of Austria-Hungary as a necessary counterbalance to the emerging powers of France and Russia. The empire's borders might have been redrawn to consolidate German influence, particularly in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. Though Austria-Hungary's diverse ethnic populations had long been a source of tension, the backing of a powerful Germany could have helped to stabilize the empire and suppress nationalist movements that sought independence or autonomy. The leadership in Vienna, backed by Berlin, would have been expected to enforce Germany's strategic interests in the region. Austria-Hungary could have been turned into a more centralized entity, with the Kaiser's influence over the region growing stronger. This reorganization could have helped suppress the ethnic tensions that plagued the empire, at least temporarily, as the focus shifted to cooperation with Germany. The fate of the South Slavic regions, particularly Serbia, would have been firmly in German hands, with a pro-German government likely installed to ensure stability. For the Ottoman Empire, a German victory would have provided a lifeline. The Ottomans, already weakened by internal strife and external pressure, might have been granted territorial concessions in exchange for their continued loyalty. Germany, with its new power and territorial gains, could have facilitated Ottoman expansion into the Middle East and the Caucasus, strengthening the Ottoman presence in these vital regions. Instead of collapsing into a series of independent states, the Ottoman Empire might have survived as a German ally, under a protectorate or even a more integrated relationship with Berlin. Germany's support could have helped the Ottomans stabilize their internal governance, ensuring that the empire remained intact. However, this would have also meant that the Ottoman Empire's future would have been tightly controlled by Germany, with Berlin determining the political and military direction of the empire. Ottoman aspirations for territorial expansion would have been aligned with German interests, and the Ottoman government would have likely been reduced to a satellite state of Berlin, rather than a truly independent power. Both Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, though weakened and heavily dependent on Germany, could have survived in a new European order dominated by the Central Powers. Their fates would have been intrinsically tied to Germany's continued supremacy, and their survival would have been largely shaped by the policies and ambitions of Berlin. The New World Order would have seen these two empires, once crumbling, reshaped into German allies with diminished autonomy, but a renewed presence in the post-war world. The role of Russia in a German victory. The role of Russia in a German victory in World War I would have been pivotal, not only in shaping the post-war landscape, but also in determining the fate of Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire, exhausted by years of conflict and facing internal unrest, was a key player whose early withdrawal from the war in 1917 significantly altered the balance of power. In an alternate scenario where Germany emerged victorious, Russia's involvement and eventual fate would have been central to how the conflict ended and how Europe was reshaped under German dominance. Had Germany won the war, Russia's political future would have been dramatically different. In the reality of 1917, the Russian Revolution led to the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and the rise of the Bolsheviks, who signed a peace treaty with Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This ended Russia's participation in the war, but the upheaval within Russia left the country in a state of chaos. In a world where Germany secured victory, however, Russia's exit from the war would have likely been managed more directly by Berlin. Rather than allowing the Bolshevik Revolution to flourish unchecked, Germany might have moved quickly to either negotiate a more favorable peace with the Russian monarchy or actively support a more conservative faction that could stabilize the Eastern Front. A more stable Russia would have given Germany a powerful ally in the east, allowing Berlin to focus its full attention on the Western Front. The absence of a revolutionary government in Russia would have prevented the upheaval that occurred in the Soviet Union and allowed Germany to secure greater influence in the region. With Russia remaining under more traditional leadership, the post-war settlement could have included the division of Eastern Europe between Germany and Russia, creating a buffer zone of pro-German states that would have ensured long-term German control over vital resources and strategic territory. Furthermore, a victorious Germany might have sought to expand its influence even further into Russia's vast territories. The signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in our timeline allowed Germany to annex large swaths of land, including parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus. A German victory might have cemented this territorial acquisition or even led to further expansion, depending on how long the war lasted. The greater German control over Russia's resource-rich areas would have been a boon to the Reich, enabling it to tap into the country's wealth of oil, grain, and minerals to fuel its post-war dominance. In the long term, the role of Russia in a German victory would have significantly altered the power dynamics of Europe and Asia. The Russian Empire might have been reduced to a German puppet state or partitioned into smaller, pro-German republics. Russia's once proud status as a European power would have been diminished, replaced by a German-dominated Eastern Europe. This shift would have ensured that Germany's influence extended far beyond its borders, solidifying its place as the central power in the post-war world. Chapter 4: The Kaiser's World Empire. A German victory in World War I would have paved the way for the Kaiser's dream of a vast world empire, extending Germany's influence across continents and establishing it as the dominant global power. The triumph of the Central Powers would have enabled the German Empire to secure control over vast territories in Europe, Africa, and Asia, transforming the map of the world and giving the Kaiser an unprecedented opportunity to create an imperial system built on military dominance, economic strength, and strategic alliances. In Europe, Germany's first priority would have been consolidating its dominance over the defeated powers. France, having been severely weakened, would have been forced to accept German control over key territories, such as Alsace-Lorraine, and possibly other regions along its borders. The Treaty of London, or a similar peace agreement, would have restructured Europe, with Germany imposing its will on its neighbors and ensuring no future threat to its security or prosperity. The Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, would have been preserved or strengthened, serving as a loyal ally in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, ensuring that Germany's strategic position was unchallenged. In Africa, Germany would have expanded its colonial holdings significantly. The defeat of France and Britain would have allowed Germany to claim their colonies in Africa, establishing a German-dominated colonial empire, stretching from North Africa to sub-Saharan regions. The newly acquired territories would have been exploited for their resources, particularly in rubber, minerals, and agricultural products. Germany would have established a system of direct rule over these colonies, with a focus on resource extraction and economic exploitation to benefit the Reich. Germany's imperial ambitions would not have been confined to Europe and Africa. The Middle East and parts of Asia, including China, would have fallen under German influence. The Ottoman Empire, once a shaky ally, could have been integrated into the German sphere of influence, with Germany supporting Ottoman expansion into regions such as the Caucasus and the Arabian Peninsula. The Berlin to Baghdad Railway, a major German infrastructure project, would have become a key part of this expanded empire, connecting Germany's interests in Europe to its newly acquired Middle Eastern territories. In the Pacific, Germany would have sought to expand its presence, particularly in the South Pacific and the Far East. German colonies in the Pacific would have been expanded, with German naval power securing the seas and ensuring that German interests were protected. This would have been part of a broader strategy to challenge the growing influence of the United States and Japan in the region. The Kaiser's vision of a world empire would have been characterized by a system of alliances, with Germany at the center of a global network of subordinate nations. This empire would have been maintained through military strength, economic control, and political manipulation. The Kaiser's world empire would have redefined the global order, with Germany as the preeminent power, controlling vast swathes of the Earth's surface and shaping the future of the 20th century. German colonial expansion in Africa and Asia. A German victory in World War I would have had profound implications for the colonial ambitions of the German Empire, particularly in Africa and Asia. With the defeat of the Allied powers, Germany would have been free to expand its territorial holdings and exert control over regions previously dominated by Britain, France, and other European powers. This new colonial empire would have been crucial to Germany's economic and strategic goals, providing vital resources and strengthening its global position. In Africa, the first step for Germany would have been the consolidation and expansion of its existing colonies, which included territories in modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. Germany's pre-war colonial holdings were already economically valuable, but the addition of former French and British colonies would have significantly altered the balance of power on the continent. Germany could have claimed French-controlled West Africa, including rich regions like Senegal, Mali, and the Ivory Coast, as well as British colonies in East Africa and the Nile Valley. The British territories in Egypt and Sudan, strategically important due to their proximity to the Suez Canal, would likely have been absorbed into the German Empire. With this expanded territorial reach, Germany would have become the dominant colonial power in Africa, securing control over essential resources like rubber, minerals, and agricultural goods, and reinforcing its global trade networks. Germany's colonial ambitions in Asia would have been just as ambitious. With the defeat of France and Britain, Germany would have been in a position to challenge British and French dominance in the Far East. Germany's strategic interests would have focused on securing territories in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. In China, Germany already held concessions in cities like Tsingtao, and a victorious Germany would have expanded its influence by claiming other key Chinese regions and ports, further consolidating its power in East Asia. Germany would have sought to challenge British and Japanese interests in the Pacific, aiming to expand its territories in the South Pacific. The German colonies in New Guinea and the Marshall Islands could have been expanded, and the region would have been strategically important for Germany's naval and commercial power. Furthermore, Germany would have likely sought to exert greater influence in Japan's sphere of interest, particularly in the context of Chinese trade and resources. The German colonial expansion in Africa and Asia would have been built on the foundations of military superiority, economic exploitation, and strategic alliances. Germany's empire would have been shaped by the exploitation of raw materials, the establishment of military bases, and the creation of a global network of colonies that fed into its European-centric empire. By controlling key resources, ports, and trade routes, Germany would have strengthened its position as the preeminent imperial power, reshaping the world's geopolitical and economic landscape for the 20th century. The role of the United States in a German-dominated world. In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, the role of the United States would have been dramatically reshaped. The United States, which entered the war in 1917 and helped tip the balance in favor of the Allies, would find itself in a much different position in a German-dominated world order. Without the critical intervention of American forces, the United States would have had to navigate the new global landscape carefully, balancing its isolationist tendencies with the reality of being surrounded by a triumphant Germany and its allies. The most immediate impact of a German victory would be the stifling of American ambitions for global influence. With the collapse of France and Britain as major powers, Germany would have emerged as the undisputed hegemon in Europe. The United States, traditionally focused on its own hemisphere, would have been forced to contend with a Europe that was not only under German control, but also heavily intertwined with German economic and military power. The European colonial empires of Britain and France would have fallen under German control, shifting global power dynamics and reducing American influence over international trade and diplomacy. In this new order, the United States would likely have focused on protecting its interests in the Western Hemisphere, particularly by ensuring the stability of its own territories and trade routes. The Monroe Doctrine, which had long been a cornerstone of American foreign policy, would have taken on even greater importance, as the U.S. sought to prevent any German encroachment on the Americas. At the same time, the U.S. might have sought to strengthen its economic ties with Germany, understanding that Germany's dominance in Europe would have significant repercussions for global trade. Germany's control over key resources, such as rubber and oil, would have made it a critical trading partner for the United States, and the U.S. would likely have needed to balance its interests with the reality of Germany's global power. On the world stage, the United States would have found itself in a delicate position. While it may have remained a major economic power, its political and military influence would have been diminished by the overwhelming presence of Germany. The United States might have sought to preserve its autonomy and avoid direct conflict with the German Empire, but it would have also faced increasing pressure to align with German policies, particularly in areas like global trade, military expansion, and colonial governance. In the long term, the United States could have been forced to reconsider its role in the global balance of power. Whether through economic cooperation or diplomatic maneuvering, the U.S. would have had to adapt to the realities of a German-dominated world. The pursuit of international influence through democratic ideals would have been challenged by the rise of an authoritarian German empire, leading to a fundamental shift in American foreign policy and its interactions with the rest of the world. Economic and military alliances under German rule. In a world dominated by Germany following a World War I victory, the nature of international relations would have shifted drastically, with Germany establishing a web of economic and military alliances designed to solidify its position as the global hegemon. These alliances would have been based not on mutual respect or democratic values, but on a pragmatic approach to power, resource extraction, and maintaining control over vast territories. Germany's dominance would have necessitated strategic partnerships, both within Europe and beyond, as it sought to maintain its newfound empire and its military and economic supremacy. One of the first steps in cementing Germany's control would have been the establishment of military alliances designed to deter any potential uprisings or resistance within its borders and colonies. The central power of this system would have been the German Reich itself, with its strong military and industrial base. To maintain stability in Europe, Germany would have worked to ensure that its allies, such as Austria-Hungary and Italy, remained loyal through both coercion and mutual benefit. Austria-Hungary, while weakened after the war, would likely have been kept in a subordinate position, benefiting from Germany's protection and economic support. This relationship would have reinforced German control over Eastern Europe and the Balkans. In addition to Europe, Germany's reach would have extended into Africa and Asia, where its colonial holdings were expanded after the war. Germany would have formed alliances with local powers in these regions, offering military support and economic incentives in exchange for loyalty and access to resources. In Africa, where Germany would have absorbed French and British colonies, it could have forged partnerships with local elites to secure control over valuable resources such as rubber, minerals, and agricultural products. Similarly, in Asia, Germany would have sought to strengthen its position by aligning with key powers in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, possibly even seeking to neutralize British influence in India and China by offering protection or trade agreements. The economic alliances under German rule would have been rooted in the exploitation of resources from across the empire. German-controlled territories in Africa and Asia would have been treated as resource extraction zones, with raw materials flowing back to Germany to fuel its industrial and military machine. These territories would have been integrated into a broader economic system that benefited the German state while keeping local populations under strict control. Trade agreements with its allies would have been tilted in Germany's favor, ensuring that the Reich retained the lion's share of profits. Militarily, Germany would have maintained a strong, centralized force to police its empire and protect its interests. It would have used its military power to maintain order, suppress dissent, and eliminate any threats to its dominance. Any resistance in its colonies or neighboring territories would have been met with overwhelming force, ensuring that the military alliances Germany cultivated would be reinforced by the constant threat of German retribution. Under this new world order, economic and military alliances would have been crucial tools for Germany to retain its imperial control and to exert its influence across the globe. These alliances would not have been based on shared ideals, but on the reality of power, ensuring the dominance of Germany and its military-industrial complex for the foreseeable future. Chapter 5: Society and Culture in the Unbroken Reich. In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, society and culture would have undergone significant transformations shaped by the imperial ambitions of the German state and the authoritarian nature of the regime. The concept of a unified, militaristic society would have been deeply ingrained in every aspect of life, from the arts and education to family structures and personal identity. The German victory would have reinforced the ideals of nationalism, discipline, and order, while suppressing dissenting voices and alternative cultural movements. At the core of German society in this alternate reality would be a strong sense of loyalty to the state and the Kaiser. The monarchy would remain firmly in control, with Kaiser Wilhelm II as the figurehead of a renewed imperial regime. The role of the state would be central to every aspect of life, with citizens expected to align their values and actions with the goals of the empire. The military would play a significant role in everyday life, both as a protector of the Reich and as an institution that reinforced the values of duty, sacrifice, and discipline. Young men would be expected to serve in the military, and the concept of militarism would permeate education, media, and popular culture. Culturally, the arts would serve the interests of the state. German culture, once associated with the high ideals of romanticism and intellectual achievement, would be reshaped to align with the empire's vision of strength and unity. Artists, writers, and musicians would be expected to produce works that celebrated the power and grandeur of the Reich, promoting themes of nationalism, loyalty, and military valor. The state would exert significant control over the production of culture, ensuring that any dissenting or anti-authoritarian voices were silenced. The regime would support a version of classical German culture that glorified the past, particularly the times of Frederick the Great and Bismarck, while suppressing any avant-garde or progressive movements that might challenge the status quo. In the realm of education, the system would be heavily influenced by the needs of the empire. Young Germans would be indoctrinated from an early age in the virtues of loyalty, discipline, and obedience to the state. The curriculum would be focused on preparing future generations to serve the empire, whether in the military, the bureaucracy, or in colonial administration. Science and technology would be prioritized, with an emphasis on developing new weapons, industrial technologies, and systems of governance that would strengthen Germany's global position. The expansion of the German Empire would also influence society in its newly acquired colonies. In Africa and Asia, German rule would impose a strict hierarchy, with the German colonizers at the top and local populations subject to subjugation and control. Colonial administrators would govern these regions with a mix of militaristic authority and economic exploitation, enforcing the cultural values of the Reich while exploiting local resources for the benefit of the German state. In this unbroken Reich, society would be characterized by conformity, loyalty, and discipline. The empire would seek to impose a uniform cultural identity that celebrated German strength and unity while suppressing any opposition or alternative visions for the future. The survival of the monarchy and aristocracy. In a German-dominated world following a victory in World War I, the survival of the monarchy and aristocracy would have been a cornerstone of the new imperial order. The German Empire, with the Kaiser at its helm, would have maintained a strong authoritarian structure, deeply rooted in the traditions of monarchy and aristocratic privilege. The preservation of the imperial family, along with the continued prominence of the German aristocracy, would have been crucial to solidifying the political and social stability of the Reich. The monarchy, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, would have remained a symbol of unity and strength in the post-war era. The victory in the Great War would have solidified the Kaiser's legitimacy, ensuring that the monarchy remained the central pillar of the German state. The Kaiser's position as both a military leader and the head of state would have been further entrenched, with his authority extending into every aspect of governance, military command, and foreign diplomacy. The imperial family would have played a vital role in maintaining the cohesion of the state, acting as both symbolic and practical representatives of Germany's power. The aristocracy, traditionally the ruling elite in Germany, would have seen its influence reinforced by the war's outcome. In the aftermath of a German victory, the aristocracy would have been rewarded with greater political and economic power. Many noble families would have been elevated, gaining control over key positions in the military, government, and business sectors. The economic and social systems would remain heavily stratified, with the aristocracy continuing to enjoy privileges such as land ownership, titles, and significant wealth, while the working classes would remain subservient. The aristocracy's role as landowners and military officers would have given them considerable authority over the vast colonial territories that Germany acquired, further solidifying their place in the empire's power structure. Socially, the monarchy and aristocracy would have worked together to ensure that traditional class distinctions remained intact. The German elite would have promoted a rigid class hierarchy, reinforcing the division between the ruling class and the common people. While the monarchy and aristocracy would have been central to the political and economic system, their power would have been maintained through strict social controls, with little room for social mobility. Any attempt to challenge the established order would have been met with harsh suppression, ensuring that the old structures of privilege and authority remained unchallenged. In this world, the survival of the monarchy and aristocracy would have been a testament to the enduring power of tradition and hierarchy. While the political landscape would have been reshaped by Germany's imperial ambitions, the old structures of monarchy and nobility would have remained central to the functioning of the empire. The Kaiser and the aristocracy would have ensured that Germany remained a society rooted in a rigid class system, with power concentrated in the hands of a select few, and the common people relegated to their subordinate roles. The impact on science, art, and literature. In a world shaped by a victorious German empire, the realms of science, art, and literature would have experienced profound shifts, reflecting the ideals and objectives of the new imperial order. The political, military, and cultural dominance of Germany would have redefined not only the trajectory of scientific advancements, but also the themes and expressions of artistic and literary works, all of which would be shaped by the empire's authoritative nature. Science would have flourished under a government deeply invested in technological progress and military power. The German state, focused on maintaining its superiority on the world stage, would have poured resources into scientific research, particularly in fields that supported military and industrial goals. Physics, chemistry, and engineering would have seen significant advances driven by a demand for new weapons, infrastructure, and systems of governance. The state would have heavily influenced research agendas, ensuring that scientific progress aligned with the empire's interests, from military technology to advancements in medicine, particularly as they related to maintaining control over the empire's vast territories. Scientists who could contribute to the empire's military and industrial dominance would have been highly regarded, their work often subsidized by state funds. However, scientific pursuits that contradicted the regime's values or threatened its control would have been suppressed or discouraged, leading to a narrowing of intellectual exploration in certain fields. In the world of art, the culture of the German Empire would have exerted a profound influence on what was produced and celebrated. Artistic expression would have been seen as an instrument for glorifying the state, promoting ideals of strength, unity, and militarism. The art world would have largely abandoned the modernist movements that characterized much of pre-war Europe, opting instead for grandiose nationalistic works that depicted Germany's military prowess and the grandeur of its empire. Artists would have been expected to celebrate the strength of the state, using their work to inspire patriotism and loyalty to the imperial regime. The regime might have supported certain classical styles and artists who adhered to its ideals, fostering a controlled artistic environment. In literature, the themes of German superiority and the glory of the Reich would have dominated. Writers would have been expected to align their works with the state's vision of heroism, duty, and sacrifice. The literature of this period would likely have been infused with nationalism and militarism, glorifying the virtues of obedience and loyalty to the state. The voices of dissent, or those who questioned the authority of the empire, would have been silenced or marginalized, leading to a literary landscape that favored works that reinforced the power structures of the Reich. Intellectual freedom would have been heavily restricted, and literature would have been used as a tool for ideological control. Ultimately, science, art, and literature in a German-dominated world would have been steered by the needs and goals of the empire. While there would be innovation and cultural output, it would be deeply intertwined with the regime's need for control, unity, and strength, stifling independent thought and expression in favor of state-approved narratives. A different path for women's rights and social movements. In a world where Germany triumphed in World War I, the trajectory of women's rights and social movements would have taken a dramatically different course. The political and social structures of the victorious German Empire would have shaped the role of women in ways that aligned with the empire's authoritarian, militaristic, and patriarchal values. Rather than experiencing the progressive strides seen in the early 20th century, women's rights would have been stifled under a regime that prioritized state control and traditional gender roles. In Germany, the victory would likely have reinforced the patriarchal nature of society, where women's primary role was seen as caretakers, mothers, and supporters of the empire. The state would have promoted the ideal of the perfect woman. As someone who embodied domesticity, service to the state, and loyalty to the Kaiser. The government would have discouraged women's participation in the workforce, viewing their role as limited to the home, raising children, and supporting their husbands. The strong military and nationalistic culture would have emphasized male strength and leadership, relegating women to subordinate roles in both public and private life. In this alternate reality, the suffrage movements that gained momentum in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom might have been either severely restricted or entirely suppressed. Women's right to vote would likely have been a low priority in the imperial regime, as the focus would have been on maintaining stability through rigid social structures. Social movements, particularly those advocating for gender equality, would have faced significant opposition from both the government and the public. Rather than viewing women's rights as an important issue, the empire would have seen them as a distraction from the core mission of maintaining imperial power. Social movements, in general, would have been heavily controlled and aligned with the goals of the state. Any form of dissent, whether it was related to gender, class, or race, would have been crushed in favor of maintaining order and loyalty to the empire. Social reforms, if any, would have been limited to small-scale projects aimed at maintaining the empire's stability, such as welfare policies that kept women in traditional roles rather than empowering them to pursue independence or professional careers. Women's rights in this alternate world would likely have remained static or regressed, as the German Empire's dominance would have discouraged progressive social change. The focus would have been on reinforcing the status quo, leaving little room for the feminist movements that we recognize today. Women in this world would have found their voices largely stifled as they navigated a society that viewed their roles as secondary to the needs of the state and the maintenance of imperial power. Chapter 6: The British and French Response. In a world where Germany emerges victorious in World War I, the responses of Britain and France would have been pivotal in shaping the post-war global order. The defeat of the Allied powers would leave Britain and France grappling with the consequences of their loss, their imperial ambitions under threat, and their national identities deeply shaken. The shifting power dynamics would force both nations to confront their changing roles on the world stage and adapt to a new geopolitical reality under German dominance. For Britain, the loss of the war would have been a catastrophic blow to its imperial prestige. Having once been the global superpower, the British Empire would have been forced to reevaluate its future in a world dominated by Germany. The loss of key territories and influence in Europe would have significantly weakened Britain's standing, leaving it vulnerable to German pressure in colonial holdings, particularly in Africa and Asia. The British response would have been one of survival, trying to maintain its remaining global influence while negotiating with Germany for the preservation of its empire. However, the success of German colonial expansion would place Britain in a defensive posture, leading to a more isolationist foreign policy and a focus on safeguarding its remaining colonies. For France, the aftermath of a German victory would be even more devastating. The destruction of much of its territory during the war, combined with the humiliation of defeat, would have left France severely weakened and demoralized. France, already devastated by the war's toll on its people and infrastructure, would be forced to contend with the loss of the Franco-German borderlands, particularly Alsace-Lorraine, and a weakened position in Europe. France's response would likely be a shift toward rebuilding its military and political influence, potentially seeking alliances with other discontented powers to counterbalance Germany's dominance. In this new reality, France would likely have retreated inward, focusing on rebuilding its economy and recovering its national pride. Both nations would face internal unrest as a result of the war's outcome. Economic struggles, political upheaval, and social dissatisfaction would stir in Britain and France, especially as their citizens came to terms with the fact that their once proud empires were now subordinate to German power. The growth of nationalist and anti-German sentiment could also fuel protests and unrest, challenging their governments to maintain stability. In response to their defeat, both Britain and France would have had to navigate a delicate balance between resisting Germany's dominance and accommodating the new world order. They would have sought ways to preserve their cultures and identities, though with far fewer resources and allies at their disposal. As Germany consolidated power in Europe, Britain and France would have been left to reconsider their place in a world reshaped by a victorious Reich. Resistance or submission? In a world where Germany's victory in World War I reshapes the global order, The question of whether nations would resist or submit to the new imperial regime would define the political landscape of the 20th century. With Germany's dominance over Europe and the threat of military power looming over former enemies and neutral states alike, the response of individual nations would be crucial in determining the future balance of power. Resistance or submission would be a delicate choice for many countries, influenced by their strategic interests, economic dependence, and the might of the German Empire. For nations like Britain and France, resistance would be a natural instinct. The deep-rooted sense of nationalism and pride in their historical empires would make it difficult for them to accept German hegemony. However, their ability to resist would be severely limited by their weakened positions. Both countries, having lost the war, would have to navigate the immense power of the German military and economy. They might seek covert means of defiance, fostering resistance movements within occupied territories or attempting to form alliances with discontented powers. But open confrontation with the German Empire would be risky. Any significant resistance would face the threat of swift retaliation, making submission seem like a pragmatic option. For smaller nations or those under direct German control, the choice would be even starker. With Germany's growing influence over Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and parts of Scandinavia, countries like Belgium, Poland, and the Czech lands would be faced with the reality of subjugation. In such cases, submission might be the only viable option to preserve internal stability and avoid complete destruction. The German Empire would likely impose strict economic and political controls, but for many nations, the alternative of armed resistance would seem impossible without external support. The question of resistance or submission would also play out within the populations of occupied countries. Citizens who resisted the German occupation would face severe consequences, from imprisonment to execution, creating an atmosphere of fear. Yet, resistance movements, especially those in the underground or in the form of civil disobedience, could emerge. The morale and willingness of civilians to submit or fight would depend on the level of oppression they faced, as well as the hope for eventual liberation. In the face of overwhelming German power, many nations would likely choose submission in the short term, hoping for more favorable terms or eventual rebellion once the empire's grip weakened. But the long-term survival of national identities and autonomy would hinge on whether there could be a unified and successful resistance capable of challenging the strength of the German-dominated world order. How a defeated France and Britain would rebuild. The aftermath of a German victory in World War I would leave France and Britain deeply wounded, both militarily and psychologically. As the war's victors, Germany would dominate Europe, and both France and Britain would be forced to reckon with their diminished power and prestige. The rebuilding process for these once mighty nations would be fraught with challenges, requiring both resilience and adaptation to a new geopolitical reality. For France, the consequences of defeat would be especially harsh. The war had already devastated large parts of French territory, particularly in the north, where much of the fighting had occurred. With much of its infrastructure destroyed and its population decimated, France would face a monumental task in rebuilding its economy and society. The loss of key border regions to Germany, including Alsace-Lorraine, would not only strip France of valuable land, but also threaten its sense of national identity. In the immediate aftermath, France would focus on internal recovery, seeking to restore its agricultural output, revive its industrial base, and reconstruct its war-torn cities. However, the absence of a strong military deterrent to German expansion would push France into a more defensive posture, leading to a reevaluation of its international alliances and diplomatic strategies. Britain's rebuilding process would take a different shape. While the British Isles remained largely untouched by the fighting, the war had strained Britain's imperial resources, and the loss of influence on the continent would hurt its global standing. Economically, Britain would struggle with the debt incurred during the war, as well as the financial demands of maintaining its far-flung empire. The British government would likely have to make difficult decisions regarding the future of its colonies, potentially granting more autonomy or even independence to some territories in an attempt to preserve what remained of its empire. The loss of international power would prompt Britain to turn inward, focusing on rebuilding its economy and securing its remaining colonial holdings. The British public's sense of national pride would be tested, and efforts to revitalize the country's status would include a renewed emphasis on industrial production, military strength, and economic self-sufficiency. Both nations would likely face political instability in the years following their defeat. The disillusionment with their leadership, combined with the economic hardship and loss of territory, could lead to the rise of radical political movements. In France, a desire to restore the glory of the Republic might fuel nationalist sentiments, while in Britain, social unrest could prompt calls for reforms to address the changing dynamics of class and power. Despite the immediate setbacks, however, both France and Britain would be determined to recover, adapting to the harsh new realities of a world dominated by Germany while striving to maintain their cultural and historical legacies. The role of nationalism and revolutionary movements. In a world where Germany has triumphed in World War I, nationalism and revolutionary movements would play a significant role in shaping the future of Europe and beyond. The defeat of France and Britain, combined with the rise of a dominant German empire, would spark both internal and external resistance as oppressed peoples sought to reclaim their sovereignty and challenge the New World Order. Nationalism, driven by the desire for independence, self-determination, and the preservation of cultural identity, would be a powerful force, while revolutionary movements aimed at overturning the status quo would emerge in response to the harsh realities of German rule. In occupied territories and within the defeated nations themselves, nationalism would be a rallying cry for those seeking to restore their national pride and independence. The humiliation and subjugation of countries like France, Belgium, and Poland would fuel nationalist movements focused on reclaiming their land, culture, and autonomy from German control. In these regions, the idea of a free, sovereign nation would become a symbol of resistance, as groups from all walks of life, from intellectuals to peasants, would join the cause. The French, for example, would likely see their defeat as a betrayal of their national spirit, and nationalist movements would grow stronger as a means of recovering their lost territories and reasserting their identity. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, where Germany's dominance would threaten the existence of smaller nations, such as Poland and Czechoslovakia, nationalism would fuel uprisings and calls for independence. Revolutionary movements, meanwhile, would challenge the authoritarian structures imposed by the German Empire. Across Europe, the harsh realities of a defeated and weakened continent, combined with the widespread social and economic upheaval caused by the war, would provide fertile ground for radical ideologies. Marxist, socialist, and anarchist movements would take root as a response to both the oppressive rule of the Germans and the economic hardship faced by the working class. These revolutionary ideas would spread in the wake of the war, particularly in countries where resentment against the existing elite ran deep. In France and Britain, where social unrest and class divisions were already present before the war, revolutionary movements would find supporters among the disenfranchised, particularly in urban centers. However, the power of nationalism and revolutionary movements would not be easily contained. The German Empire would have to navigate the challenge of suppressing these uprisings while maintaining its grip on Europe. Its military might, while formidable, would not guarantee the loyalty of occupied peoples, and continued resistance could lead to prolonged instability across the continent. The rise of these movements would fundamentally reshape the political landscape, as governments would be forced to address the growing dissatisfaction or risk facing full-scale insurrection. Ultimately, the forces of nationalism and revolution would test the durability of the New World Order established by Germany's victory, as the dream of a united and free Europe continued to fuel opposition to imperial rule. Chapter 7: The Fate of the United States. In a world where Germany has emerged victorious in World War I, the fate of the United States would be marked by significant political, economic, and social upheaval. The United States' decision to enter the war had been a pivotal moment in the conflict, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. However, in this alternate history, where Germany has secured a dominant position in Europe, the U.S. would find itself grappling with the consequences of its involvement in the war, as well as the broader implications of a new world order under German hegemony. One of the most immediate effects of a German victory would be the United States' diminished influence on the global stage. The war had already strained U.S. resources and resulted in considerable loss of life, but the outcome of the conflict would leave the country with a lingering sense of frustration and a loss of its moral standing as a defender of freedom and democracy. The ideological drive behind U.S. intervention, the belief that Germany's militaristic expansionism threatened the balance of power in Europe, would seem hollow in the face of a victorious German empire. For many Americans, the question of why they fought would remain unanswered, leading to a period of national introspection and disillusionment. Domestically, the economic impact of the war would be severe. While the U.S. had emerged as an industrial powerhouse by supplying the Allies, the collapse of the Allied powers and the shifting geopolitical landscape would result in the loss of lucrative markets and trade routes. The U.S. economy, which had flourished during the war years, would experience a sharp downturn as Europe recovered under German control. In this new world order, the U.S. would have to reorient its economic policies, potentially focusing on internal development, self-sufficiency, and the preservation of its own interests, as foreign markets under German dominance would be increasingly difficult to access. Politically, the U.S. would likely turn inward, facing pressure from isolationists who would argue against further involvement in European affairs. The trauma of the war and the failure to achieve the desired outcome would breed a strong sentiment of non-interventionism. With the U.S. no longer the primary global power, its political leaders would focus on stabilizing the home front, protecting American sovereignty, and avoiding entanglements in European conflicts. This isolationist stance could lead to a reassertion of American nationalism as the country sought to protect itself from the growing influence of foreign powers. Socially, the U.S. would be affected by the lingering scars of the war, the loss of American soldiers, the trauma of the conflict, and the political fallout from a defeated world would create divisions within society. There could be a rise in radical ideologies, particularly among disillusioned veterans, workers, and those who felt betrayed by the government's failure to secure a decisive victory. Movements for social reform, labor rights, and anti-imperialism could gain traction as the U.S. reeled from the effects of a world that had shifted under Germany's dominance. Ultimately, the United States would have to redefine its place in the world, facing a new era in which the old assumptions about American exceptionalism and global leadership were challenged by the reality of a Europe firmly under German control. The nation would grapple with how to rebuild its economy, secure its political future, and adjust to a world in which its former role as a dominant power was no longer assured. Isolationism or engagement in global affairs. In the wake of Germany's victory in World War I, the United States would face a crucial decision regarding its future role in global affairs. Having entered the war with the intention of preserving the balance of power in Europe and protecting democratic ideals, the aftermath of a German-dominated Europe would force Americans to reconsider their international stance. The choice between isolationism and engagement in global affairs would become one of the defining issues of the post-war era. Isolationism, already a prevailing sentiment in parts of American society, would gain considerable traction in this new world. With Europe firmly under German control, the U.S. would no longer see the same direct threats to its national security. The belief that European conflicts were distant and unrelated to American interests would be compelling to many, especially after the trauma of the war. For isolationists, the failures of interventionist foreign policy during World War I would prove that the U.S. should focus on domestic concerns rather than entangling itself in the affairs of other nations. They would argue that, with Germany at the helm of Europe, there was no longer a need for the U.S. to intervene in European politics. Instead, the U.S. could concentrate on strengthening its economy, securing its borders, and avoiding the unpredictable turbulence of European geopolitics. On the other hand, there would be those who saw engagement in global affairs as essential to maintaining American influence and safeguarding its interests. While Germany may have been victorious, the U.S. would still be a major economic power with vast resources. Advocates for engagement would argue that, even with a powerful Germany, the U.S. had a stake in shaping global trade, securing access to markets, and ensuring that the New World Order did not threaten American ideals. For these proponents, American leadership on the world stage could help contain the excesses of a German-dominated Europe and promote international stability. They would likely advocate for strategic alliances, economic diplomacy, and involvement in international organizations, aiming to preserve U.S. influence while navigating the complexities of a reshaped world. Ultimately, the decision between isolationism and engagement would shape U.S. foreign policy for years to come. Both camps would present compelling arguments, and the outcome would depend on how the American people and their leaders responded to the post-war landscape. Whether the U.S. chose to retreat from international affairs or sought to redefine its role in a new world order, the effects would be profound, influencing global politics, economics, and security in the decades that followed. German-American relations and economic ties. In the wake of Germany's victory in World War I, the relationship between the United States and Germany would undergo a significant transformation. The initial antagonism caused by the war would gradually shift toward economic cooperation as both nations sought to rebuild and reassert their dominance in a world where the balance of power had dramatically shifted. While the political dynamics between the two countries would remain complex, economic ties would become a critical point of interaction in the decades that followed. With the defeat of the Allies and Germany's consolidation of power in Europe, the economic landscape of the world would be reshaped. Germany, having emerged as the dominant force in Europe, would look to expand its influence beyond its borders, including in the United States. The U.S., despite its initial reluctance to engage in European affairs, would have strong economic incentives to establish positive relations with Germany. Germany's industrial capacity, combined with its control over vast territories and resources, would create opportunities for trade, investment, and collaboration. American businesses, particularly in industries like manufacturing, technology, and agriculture, would look to capitalize on these new markets and the growing economic potential of a united Europe under German leadership. At the same time, Germany would recognize the importance of fostering strong economic ties with the United States, not only to ensure its own economic recovery, but also to gain access to American technological innovations, capital, and markets. As the U.S. had become a global economic powerhouse, Germany would seek to strengthen trade relations to further its own goals of territorial expansion and economic integration across Europe. In particular, German industries would benefit from American capital and expertise, especially in sectors such as finance, energy, and infrastructure. Despite the potential for economic cooperation, political tensions would persist. The memory of the war and the lingering resentment over U.S. involvement would create obstacles to full reconciliation. However, economic interdependence would encourage pragmatic engagement as both nations recognize the mutual benefits of stable trade relations. Over time, Germany's economic dominance in Europe and the United States' emerging role as a global economic power would create a delicate balance, with both countries carefully navigating their relationship to ensure they maximize their interests while minimizing the risk of conflict. In the broader context of global economics, German-American relations would help shape the post-war world order. The interplay between these two economic giants would influence global trade policies, technological advancements, and geopolitical strategies, as both sought to secure their place in a world that was rapidly evolving under German leadership. The evolution of these economic ties would ultimately serve as a cornerstone for the future, as the two countries sought to reshape the global economy in their image. Could the U.S. become a rival superpower? In a world where Germany had emerged victorious in World War I and consolidated its dominance over Europe, the question of whether the United States could rise to challenge Germany as a rival superpower would become a defining issue in the decades to come. While the U.S. would no longer have the same central role in global politics due to Europe's reconfiguration under German rule, its economic potential and industrial capacity would position it as a formidable power with the potential to challenge Germany's supremacy, albeit in a different manner than originally anticipated. The U.S. economy, having flourished during and after the war, would be the driving force behind its potential to become a superpower. With Germany controlling much of Europe and securing access to vast resources, the U.S. would retain its position as the world's largest industrial economy, driven by innovation and an entrepreneurial spirit. The rapid expansion of American industries, particularly in the fields of technology, agriculture, and finance, would grant the U.S. a competitive edge on the global stage. America's ability to project its economic power would lay the groundwork for its growing influence, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, where it would continue to hold sway. However, economic power alone would not be enough to challenge Germany's dominance. For the U.S. to become a true superpower, it would need to exert influence through military and political means, an area where it would face significant challenges. Germany's victory in World War I would solidify its position as the dominant military power in Europe, and the strategic alliances it formed with other nations would further reinforce its military might. Meanwhile, the U.S. would likely continue to struggle with the issue of isolationism, with significant portions of the population and political leadership preferring a focus on domestic prosperity rather than military expansion. The key to the U.S. potentially rivaling Germany would lie in its ability to forge strategic alliances, invest in military innovations, and project power globally. Given the rapid technological advancements in the early 20th century, the U.S. could develop advanced military capabilities, such as air power and naval forces, which would enable it to exert influence far beyond its borders. A shift in foreign policy, moving away from isolationism and toward engagement with global affairs, would be essential to this ambition. In the long term, the question of whether the U.S. could become a rival superpower to Germany would hinge on how both nations navigated the complexities of an altered world order. The U.S. would have to balance economic growth with the strategic imperatives of projecting military power, establishing alliances, and safeguarding its interests in a German-dominated world. The outcome would be shaped by the U.S.'s ability to adapt to a rapidly changing global environment, one where the former world powers had been upended and new forces were emerging on the horizon. Chapter 8: The Role of Technology and Industry. In the aftermath of Germany's victory in World War I, the global balance of technological and industrial power would shift dramatically. Germany's dominance over much of Europe would allow it to harness the full potential of its industrial capabilities, and its control over cutting-edge technologies would set the stage for a new era of innovation and competition. The role of technology and industry in this new world would be pivotal, shaping both the trajectory of Germany's power and the emergence of new challenges, especially for nations like the United States. With a stable industrial base and access to vital resources across Europe and parts of Africa and Asia, Germany would lead the world in technological advancements. The victory in the war would provide Germany with a unique opportunity to consolidate its economic and industrial strength. The German focus on science and engineering would translate into rapid technological developments, particularly in fields like aviation, military hardware, and chemical engineering. The country's emphasis on research and development, coupled with its control over key European manufacturing hubs, would establish it as the global leader in industrial production and technological innovation. As Germany cemented its hold over Europe, the shift in power would also foster greater investment in military technology, aimed at maintaining its dominance and preventing challenges from emerging powers. This would see a continued arms race, with Germany leveraging its technological advancements to develop new military strategies and weaponry that would solidify its superpower status. The role of technology in warfare would be crucial, as Germany would not only focus on military innovations, but also seek to maintain a technological edge in civilian industries that contributed to its economic might. Meanwhile, the United States, though geographically distant from the heart of European affairs, would still play a vital role in the technological race. With its rapidly advancing industries and natural resources, the U.S. would continue to push the envelope in areas such as automobile production, aviation, and communication technologies. However, the U.S. would need to navigate the New World Order, where Germany's control over European markets and its technological prowess would be an ongoing challenge. The global economy would evolve, with industrial production driven by the need to sustain the dominant power's military and economic ambitions. Nations across the world would seek to develop their own technological capabilities, aware that the ability to compete on the industrial stage would directly influence their geopolitical standing. The relationship between technology, industry, and power would thus become inextricably linked, with nations that failed to keep pace with Germany's advancements, risking economic and political subjugation. In this reshaped world, the competition for technological supremacy would determine not just the future of industry, but also the balance of global power, with Germany's leadership serving as both a model and a challenge for the rest of the world. Military advancements in a German-led world. In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, its dominance would not only shape the political and economic landscape of Europe, but also have profound effects on military advancements. With access to vast resources and a central position in Europe, Germany would emerge as the leading military power, influencing the trajectory of warfare technology, strategies, and military doctrine for decades to come. Germany's victory would propel it to the forefront of military innovation, where its military-industrial complex would become a cornerstone of its global strategy. The German focus on military efficiency and technological superiority, already evident during the war, would only intensify in the years following the conflict. With the war's aftermath providing opportunities for rapid development, Germany would push the boundaries of military technology in areas such as armored vehicles, aviation, and chemical warfare. Tank warfare, which had seen limited success during the war, would be refined and further developed by Germany in the interwar years. The mechanization of armies would become central to Germany's military strategy, as armored divisions would be emphasized over traditional infantry, allowing for greater speed, mobility, and firepower on the battlefield. In a German-led world, the reliance on advanced vehicles and mechanized units would revolutionize ground combat, ensuring that Germany remained several steps ahead of any potential rivals. Aviation, too, would see exponential growth in the post-war years. The development of long-range bombers, fighter planes, and reconnaissance aircraft would become a priority for Germany's military establishment. Air superiority would be key to maintaining control over its European empire and projecting power beyond its borders. Germany's early successes in aviation technology, including the development of advanced aircraft engines and the establishment of strong air forces, would continue to give it an edge over other nations. The development of chemical weapons, which had marked the horrors of World War I, would also see further advancements in a German-dominated world. Germany's expertise in chemical warfare would make it a leader in the field, although it might face moral and strategic dilemmas in using such weapons in future conflicts. The Geneva Protocol, which prohibited chemical weapons after World War I, would likely be seen as less of a constraint, especially if Germany maintained its control over European political affairs. In this new world order, military advancements would not just be about maintaining dominance. They would be a reflection of the ideological underpinnings of a victorious Germany. A focus on efficiency, innovation, and military might would be central to its vision of global power. The rise of military technologies, driven by Germany's leadership, would set the tone for future conflicts, making it clear that in a German-led world, the development and deployment of advanced military technologies would be critical to securing and maintaining global dominance. The Industrial Revolution's alternative path. In a world where Germany had emerged victorious in World War I, the trajectory of industrial development would take a sharply different path compared to the historical course of the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution that had already transformed Western nations would continue to evolve, but in ways shaped by the geopolitical realities of a German-dominated Europe. Rather than following the traditional models of Anglo-American industrial dominance, the Industrial Revolution would now be influenced by the needs, ideologies, and resources of a global power centered in Berlin. The German victory would establish the country as the industrial leader of Europe, and its military-industrial complex would be the engine driving technological and economic progress. With control over vast territories and resources, Germany would not only dominate European markets, but also integrate economies through tightly controlled industrial alliances. The coordination between government and industry that had been vital during the war would continue, fostering an environment where industrial growth was directly aligned with national power. This approach would accelerate the development of key industries, from steel production and heavy machinery to chemicals and aviation. The technological innovations of the early 20th century would be harnessed in new ways, with Germany leading in fields like automotive manufacturing, electronics, and machinery production. The Industrial Revolution's next phase would be marked by greater mechanization, with mass production techniques spreading across sectors. This process would be streamlined in a way that prioritized efficiency and output, building upon Germany's pre-war experience in engineering and innovation. At the same time, Germany's dominance would reshape the way global industry interacted. Nations outside of Europe, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, would become increasingly tied to German economic systems. Colonies and territories under German control would serve as essential suppliers of raw materials and consumer markets for German-made goods. In the United States, which would be forced into a more insular position, the Industrial Revolution's path might be slowed or altered due to limited access to the European markets and the lack of international competition from Germany. The U.S. might shift focus to different sectors, such as agriculture or domestic industries, while Germany's control over the European and African markets would solidify its industrial advantage. This alternative path would see the rise of large multinational conglomerates, tightly bound to state interests, and the centralization of production under the control of a few powerful industrial families. This top-down model, reminiscent of the wartime economy, would lead to rapid industrial growth, but would also increase the state's grip on economic life, reducing individual enterprise and economic freedom in much of the world. The Industrial Revolution in a German-dominated world would be marked by the intertwining of industrial growth, military dominance, and political control, creating an alternative path that further entrenched the power of the state and the leading industrial powers. The race for air and sea supremacy. In a world where Germany had won World War I, the race for air and sea supremacy would become a critical component of global power dynamics. The industrial and technological advancements that emerged from the war, especially in aviation and naval warfare, would push Germany to develop its military capabilities even further. Dominating both the skies and the seas would be essential for maintaining control over its European empire and asserting its power on the world stage. This competition would not only involve Germany, but also other rising powers and former global competitors trying to adjust to the new geopolitical realities. With Germany's victory, the country would focus on establishing air supremacy as a crucial component of its military doctrine. The advancements made during World War I in aircraft technology would be accelerated as Germany's aerial forces became central to its strategy. The development of long-range bombers, fighter planes, and reconnaissance aircraft would dominate the interwar years. Air forces would be expanded and modernized, with an emphasis on speed, range, and precision. Germany's superior position in aviation would allow it to control the skies over Europe, thus securing its ability to project power and control strategic territories. The importance of naval supremacy would also become increasingly apparent. Having successfully navigated the naval blockades during the war, Germany would focus on strengthening its navy, including the construction of a modern fleet that could rival Britain's. With access to the high seas and control over crucial trade routes, Germany would ensure its influence across the globe. Submarines, a powerful weapon in World War I, would continue to play a major role in Germany's naval strategy. The development of U-boats and advanced destroyers would be prioritized as they could disrupt enemy trade and military supply lines, ensuring Germany's dominance in both military and economic warfare. As Germany built up its air and sea forces, other countries, particularly Britain and France, would be forced to follow suit. The historical naval rivalry between Britain and Germany would be intensified, as Britain would struggle to regain its former maritime dominance. France, on the other hand, would focus on both air and sea technologies, attempting to carve out its own niche in the New World Order. However, with Germany at the forefront, it would be increasingly difficult for these nations to challenge its supremacy, leading to a shift in global power and influence. In this new geopolitical landscape, the race for air and sea supremacy would define the military and economic strategies of the major powers. The rapid technological advancements made during this era would lay the groundwork for future conflicts, ensuring that the battle for dominance would continue for decades. Chapter 9: The Future of Warfare and Politics. In a world where Germany had triumphed in World War I, the future of warfare and politics would be shaped by the dominant position of a German-led Europe. The global power structure would shift dramatically, with Germany setting the stage for new military and political norms that would affect the 20th century and beyond. The interplay between military innovation and political strategy would become increasingly crucial, and the world would witness the evolution of warfare in ways that mirrored the technological, ideological, and geopolitical shifts of this alternative history. Military strategy in a German-dominated world would focus heavily on maintaining superiority through technological innovation and centralized command. As Germany had proven during the war, advancements in air and naval power would remain essential to securing both territorial and economic dominance. The development of advanced weaponry, including tanks, aircraft, and potentially even chemical weapons, would continue to evolve rapidly. However, the focus on mechanized warfare would be balanced by the importance of controlling resources and populations. The geopolitical landscape would be shaped by Germany's ability to project its military power, with a highly organized and professionalized military force that could intervene quickly and decisively to prevent rebellion or resistance in its empire. With the dominance of military technology, the political structure in Germany would also evolve in response to the demands of maintaining control over such vast territories. The Kaiser's regime would likely grow more authoritarian, given the centralization of power necessary to manage its empire. Political dissent within Germany and its controlled territories would be tightly suppressed, with propaganda and state control over media and education used to maintain the loyalty of the population. Totalitarian elements would become more pronounced as the state sought to enforce its ideals of nationalism, militarism, and obedience. On the global stage, Germany's victory would reshape international diplomacy. The League of Nations, in its historical form, would be irrelevant in this alternate reality. Instead, Germany would likely establish a new international order centered around its own dominance, with treaties and alliances structured around the defense of its empire and the promotion of its ideological goals. Countries outside of this system, such as the United States and Japan, would be forced into a more defensive posture. In a world with limited checks on German power, Germany's sphere of influence would be vast, with few nations able to challenge its supremacy without risking conflict. The political future of other countries, particularly the United States, would be shaped by the need to adapt to the new geopolitical realities. The U.S. might turn further inward, maintaining its isolationist policies or seeking alternative alliances to counterbalance German power. Meanwhile, former colonial powers like Britain and France, devastated by the war's outcome, would struggle to rebuild and regain their standing on the world stage, finding themselves marginalized in the face of Germany's unstoppable rise. Thus, the future of warfare and politics in this alternate world would be defined by a persistent German dominance, where military strength and political control would go hand in hand in shaping the global order. Would there still be a Second World War? In a world where Germany won World War I, the possibility of a Second World War is highly debated. With the rise of a German-dominated Europe, the political, economic, and military climate would drastically change, potentially altering the trajectory that led to the outbreak of World War II. However, while the specifics of the conflict would differ, the tensions that gave rise to World War II in our timeline might still exist, albeit in a different form. First, it's essential to consider the long-term effects of Germany's victory in World War I. The Treaty of Versailles, which harshly punished Germany in our history, would likely be replaced with a German-led settlement that imposed terms favorable to its empire. While this would secure Germany's dominance in Europe, it would also breed resentment in countries like France, Britain, and Russia, who would have to adjust to their diminished status. These tensions could persist for decades, and even if a direct military confrontation didn't occur right away, nationalist movements in these countries would likely fuel a desire to challenge Germany's hold on Europe. As a result, various resistance movements or minor conflicts could arise, leading to unstable international relations. Another key factor in the possibility of a Second World War would be the rise of new powers. The United States, as an emerging global player, might choose to engage in conflicts that could challenge Germany's dominance. A growing power in East Asia, perhaps Japan or even China, could also emerge as a rival, triggering geopolitical competition. These regional disputes could escalate into a larger, more global conflict, potentially pitting Germany against coalitions of other world powers, similar to the dynamics that eventually led to World War II. Moreover, the success of totalitarian regimes, including Germany's own, would further exacerbate the likelihood of conflict. If Germany's authoritarian rule spread across Europe, it could inspire similar movements in other countries, destabilizing the continent and creating power struggles that would inevitably result in war. Fascism, militarism, and nationalism would still be potent forces, and if other countries felt marginalized or threatened, the escalation to global conflict might become inevitable. In summary, while the precise cause of a Second World War in this alternate timeline might not mirror our own, the fundamental geopolitical forces, rising powers, ideological clashes, and unresolved tensions would likely still lead to a large-scale conflict. It would be a war fought under different circumstances, but the historical patterns of competition and rivalry suggest that a Second World War would, in all likelihood, remain a looming possibility. Germany's relations with Japan and other powers. In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, its relationships with Japan and other global powers would evolve significantly. As a dominant European power, Germany would seek to consolidate its influence through strategic alliances and economic ties. Japan, also a rising imperial power, would be one of Germany's key partners, but their relationship would be defined by both cooperation and competition. Germany's victory would allow it to secure its position as the primary power in Europe, but its interests would not be limited to the continent. With an eye toward expanding its colonial empire, Germany would likely seek to increase its presence in Africa and Asia, regions where Japan had its own imperial ambitions. The two countries might initially collaborate in these regions, potentially forming an alliance to share resources and counterbalance the influence of Western powers. However, as both nations expanded their spheres of influence, tensions could arise over competing territorial claims, particularly in Asia. Japan, having taken control of German territories in the Pacific during the war, might continue to push for greater control over the region, challenging Germany's interests and leading to a delicate balancing act in their diplomatic relations. Beyond Japan, Germany's relations with other global powers would be shaped by the new geopolitical realities. The United States, which had been drawn into the war by Germany's actions, would likely adopt a cautious approach toward the German Empire. The U.S. might choose to strengthen its position in the Western Hemisphere while maintaining economic ties with Germany, though the two nations would remain wary of each other's influence in global affairs. Britain and France, severely weakened by the war, would focus on rebuilding their empires and economies. And while they might remain diplomatically engaged with Germany, their ability to challenge its dominance would be limited. Russia, having experienced its own revolution and civil war, would be in no position to directly confront Germany. However, the unstable political environment in Russia might lead to sporadic conflicts or attempts to reclaim territories lost during the war. The rise of Soviet communism might also create ideological friction between Germany's authoritarian regime and the emerging leftist movements across Europe. In summary, Germany's relationships with Japan and other global powers would be shaped by a complex web of cooperation, competition, and strategic interest. While a degree of collaboration would likely exist between Germany and Japan, the rivalry over imperial expansion and the shifting balance of power would keep global tensions high, potentially setting the stage for future conflicts. The balance of power in a German century. In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, the balance of power in Europe and beyond would be fundamentally reshaped. With Germany at the helm of a new, expanded empire, its influence would stretch across the continent, but the resulting power dynamics would be complex and unstable. While Germany's dominance would likely be secure for a time, the balance of power in the world would never be static, and challenges would inevitably arise both from within and beyond Europe. Germany's first task would be consolidating its new territorial gains and solidifying its control over Europe. A victorious Germany would have imposed a settlement that favored its interests, weakening France, Britain, and Russia. However, the new political landscape would be fragile, as the defeated powers, despite their weakened positions, would still harbor resentment and resistance. France, in particular, would be a long-term source of tension, and while it might be politically subjugated, it would remain a significant player in European politics, with the potential to spark unrest. Over time, nationalist movements across Europe could also challenge German dominance, leading to periodic instability. Outside of Europe, the balance of power would be equally tenuous. In Asia, Japan's ambitions would increasingly come into conflict with Germany's own imperial interests, particularly in China and the Pacific. The two powers would likely face a series of diplomatic crises and could even clash militarily over territorial disputes. Meanwhile, the United States, though initially retreating into isolationism, might eventually reconsider its position as Germany's global power grows. A Germany with unchecked dominance could prompt the United States to reassert its influence, either through economic rivalry or military intervention, especially as Germany's reach extends to the Americas and Africa. Additionally, the technological and industrial advancements that Germany would leverage for military supremacy could alter the global balance of power in unforeseen ways. The continued development of air, sea, and chemical warfare would intensify competition among powers, with a new arms race likely to ensue. Germany's control of advanced military technology could give it a strategic edge, but the pressures of maintaining such a vast empire could eventually strain its resources and internal stability. In the long term, a world dominated by Germany would face a delicate and ever-changing balance of power, marked by regional tensions, imperial ambitions, and the inevitable rise of new challengers. While Germany's century of dominance might seem assured, the forces of nationalism, economic competition, and military rivalries would keep the world on edge, suggesting that the global order would be in constant flux. Chapter 10: The Unintended Consequences. A world where Germany triumphed in World War I would not be without its unintended consequences. The very victory that promised to secure German dominance would trigger a series of unforeseen events that would reverberate across Europe and beyond. These consequences would reshape not only political and economic landscapes, but also cultural and social dynamics in ways that would be difficult to predict. One of the first unintended consequences of Germany's victory would be the destabilization of Europe. While Germany might have imposed a favorable peace settlement, the terms would likely have sown seeds of long-term resentment and unrest. The harsh treatment of France and Britain, combined with the suppression of nationalism in Eastern Europe, could have led to a series of uprisings, revolutions, and regional conflicts. Nations that were relegated to subordinate status under German rule might have cultivated underground resistance movements, ready to challenge the imperial system at the first opportunity. This growing discontent could eventually provoke internal tensions within Germany itself, as the complexities of governing an empire stretched from the heart of Europe to colonies across the globe. In Asia and Africa, the unintended consequences of German expansion would also become apparent. While Germany's empire might have initially aligned with Japan's ambitions, the continued growth of both powers could have led to territorial clashes. The competition for resources and influence in China, Southeast Asia, and Africa would have sparked diplomatic crises and military confrontations. Furthermore, the rise of Germany's imperialist influence could have hastened anti-colonial movements, particularly in regions where colonial subjects began to question their subjugation. The post-war European order might have prompted more rapid decolonization, albeit through violent means, rather than peaceful transitions. Culturally, a victorious Germany would have strengthened the dominance of authoritarian ideologies across Europe, potentially influencing the rise of fascist and totalitarian movements in other countries. The success of German nationalism could have inspired similar movements in Italy, Spain, and beyond, setting the stage for a new wave of authoritarian regimes. In the long term, this would lead to a Europe increasingly divided between autocratic powers and revolutionary movements, with little room for the democratic ideals that had been so prominent before the war. Perhaps the most profound unintended consequence would be the ripple effect on the global balance of power. Germany's prolonged dominance could have delayed the emergence of the United States as a superpower. Meanwhile, the rivalry between Germany and the U.S. might have escalated into a Cold War-style standoff, impacting global trade, technological development, and military strategy. The repercussions of Germany's victory would thus extend far beyond the borders of Europe, with consequences felt across the globe for decades to come. The fate of democracy and republicanism. In a world dominated by a victorious Germany following World War I, the fate of democracy and republicanism in Europe and beyond would likely have been drastically altered. The concept of democracy, which had gained significant traction throughout the 19th century, would be severely tested under the weight of German imperial rule. The rise of an authoritarian German empire would have set a precedent for other nations, pushing Europe further away from the ideals of democratic governance and republicanism. In Germany, the Kaiser's regime would likely have remained in power for a much longer period, with little room for democratic reform. The social and political structures would have been deeply influenced by military and aristocratic elites, entrenching the power of the monarchy and the nobility. The Kaiser's Germany would have stifled Republican movements, viewing them as dangerous to the stability of the empire. In such an environment, the aspirations of liberal intellectuals and political reformers might have been crushed, with the German state promoting a strong, centralized, militaristic vision instead. For countries like France and Britain, defeated in the war and subjugated under German-imposed terms, democracy would face an uphill battle. In Britain, for example, the monarchy might regain even more power, and Republican sentiments could be suppressed through strict authoritarian governance. France, traditionally a bastion of Republican ideals, could see the rise of a more autocratic or even fascist regime as a result of the humiliation of defeat and the heavy burden of German demands. The French Revolution's legacy of liberty, equality, and fraternity might be undermined by a return to monarchy or military dictatorship, with any Republican movements either severely restricted or forced underground. Beyond Europe, the rise of a German-led world order could have sent shockwaves across the globe, threatening the spread of democratic and republican ideas in former colonies and emerging states. The example set by Germany could have inspired authoritarian regimes in other parts of the world, where democracy was already struggling to take root. In the U.S., democratic ideals might have been reinforced as a counterbalance to the European authoritarian shift, but the global influence of German militarism and imperialism would have threatened the global spread of Republican principles. In this alternative timeline, the very nature of governance could have taken a darker turn, with democracy and republicanism retreating into the shadows of history, overshadowed by the ever-growing power of authoritarianism. The world could have seen a 20th century dominated by dictatorships and empires, stifling the hopes for freedom and self-rule that defined the previous century. Would fascism and communism still rise? In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, the political landscape of the 20th century would have been drastically reshaped, possibly stunting the rise of both fascism and communism, or perhaps catalyzing them in unexpected ways. The impact of a German-dominated Europe could have altered the trajectories of these ideologies, potentially preventing their full emergence or pushing them in new directions. Fascism, as it appeared in Italy and later in Nazi Germany, thrived in the wake of national humiliation and economic instability, often fueled by a desire for strong, authoritarian leadership to restore national pride. If Germany had won the war and established its dominant position in Europe, the conditions for fascism's rise in other countries could have been different. Many European nations, particularly Italy, faced political instability and economic hardship after the war, which helped create the fertile ground for fascism. However, if Germany had imposed a new European order with its own brand of authoritarianism, it could have prevented the kind of power vacuum that allowed fascism to thrive. Rather than an external fascist movement, countries might have been more likely to align with the German model of military monarchy and centralized control, stifling the rise of homegrown fascist ideologies. On the other hand, the collapse of the Russian Empire and the rise of the Bolshevik Revolution were critical moments in the early development of communism. If Germany had secured a more stable peace with Russia and prevented the Bolshevik Revolution, the global spread of communism might have been significantly delayed or even prevented. Without the fall of the Russian Empire and the subsequent creation of the Soviet Union, the appeal of communism in Europe and beyond might have been less pronounced. However, it is possible that communist ideas could have taken root in other nations facing inequality and social unrest, particularly in the working class movements across Europe. The continued dominance of the German Empire could have led to tensions with these movements, potentially fostering a different form of leftist revolution. In either case, the balance of power in Europe would have been reshaped by Germany's victory, with the rise of fascism and communism potentially taking different forms. The competition between these ideologies, often fueled by opposition to capitalist democracies, might have played out in different arenas, such as colonial territories or through proxy wars, rather than directly challenging European political systems. Ultimately, the world may have seen the rise of authoritarian regimes, but whether they were fascist or communist in nature would have depended on how the forces of rebellion and revolution interacted with the overarching power of the German Empire. The global economy under German leadership. In a world where Germany had emerged victorious in World War I, the global economy would have been dramatically reshaped under its leadership. With the defeat of Britain and France and the subsequent establishment of the German Empire as the dominant European power, the global financial system would likely have become heavily influenced by German economic policies and interests. This shift in power could have led to the creation of a more centralized and controlled global economy, with Germany at the center, determining the rules of trade, industry, and finance. One of the first impacts of Germany's victory would have been its dominance over European markets. Germany, already an industrial powerhouse, would have likely strengthened its control over key sectors like steel, coal, and chemicals, expanding its economic influence throughout Europe. The newly established economic order would have solidified the German position as a leader in technological innovation, industrial production, and infrastructure development. With the end of the war, Germany would likely have sought to secure raw materials and new markets across Europe and potentially beyond in Africa and Asia, further entrenching its economic control. The global financial system would have been reshaped by Germany's banking system, which had been one of the most advanced in Europe prior to the war. A victorious Germany would likely have established a more German-centric global banking system, in which the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, played a leading role. This could have led to a greater use of the Deutsche Mark in international trade, reducing the influence of the British pound and the US dollar, potentially altering the very structure of global finance. Trade routes and economic partnerships would have shifted in favor of Germany, especially with the collapse of Britain's naval dominance. The British Empire, which had long controlled vast trade networks, would have seen its influence waning. In contrast, Germany would have sought to expand its own influence over vital shipping routes and ports. The British colonies might have been forced to negotiate new terms with Germany, potentially falling under German control or influence as part of a new imperial arrangement. At the same time, Germany's success in maintaining control over key industrial sectors could have also led to a more structured and regulated world economy, one that was perhaps less prone to the economic cycles of boom and bust that defined the interwar period. This could have resulted in a more planned, controlled global economy under German leadership, though it would likely have sparked tensions and resistance in nations that sought to retain autonomy over their economic systems. Chapter 11: Alternate 20th Century Conflicts. In a world where Germany triumphed in World War I, the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century would have unfolded quite differently. The defeat of the Allies would have led to a host of alternate conflicts, shaped by the new balance of power. These potential clashes, while not as cataclysmic as the two world wars we know, would have dramatically altered global politics, economics, and the course of history. One of the most immediate consequences would have been the shifting dynamics in Europe. With Germany consolidating its dominance, the balance of power would likely have fostered tension between the German Empire and various rising nationalist movements within its sphere of influence, particularly in Eastern Europe. The newly empowered Soviet Union, for instance, might have confronted Germany over control of territories like Poland and Ukraine, leading to conflicts along the Eastern Front. Even if Germany had forged a temporary peace with the Bolsheviks, regional tensions and border disputes could have erupted into sporadic, localized wars. In Britain, the loss of global influence and the collapse of its colonial empire might have led to internal conflict. The British Empire was already dealing with growing independence movements, especially in India. Without the unity forged in the First World War, nationalist movements across the empire could have become more aggressive, possibly sparking a series of uprisings or rebellions against British rule. The decline of the British Navy could have also emboldened France, which might have sought to assert itself more aggressively in Europe and its former colonies, leading to military confrontations with the German Empire or even between European powers over the remains of the British Empire. Additionally, the United States, which had remained on the sidelines during much of the war, could have been drawn into a number of conflicts in the decades following Germany's victory. If the U.S. had pursued isolationist policies, it could have seen an increased role in global peacekeeping efforts or armed interventions in response to regional conflicts in the Americas or Asia, where both Germany and Japan sought greater influence. American involvement in the Pacific might have spurred rivalries with Japanese and German interests, potentially leading to clashes in the Pacific theater much earlier than we saw in our timeline. As these alternate conflicts unfolded, the broader international system would have been defined by a greater emphasis on military alliances and Cold War-like tensions between the powers. The world may not have seen a single, all-encompassing global war, but a series of localized conflicts, often driven by the ambitions of rising regional powers. These conflicts could have ultimately shaped the political map of the mid-20th century in ways that are almost unimaginable within the framework of our reality. Would colonial revolts still happen? In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, the trajectory of colonial revolts and independence movements would have been significantly altered. With Germany's new role as the dominant power in Europe and the global order, the fate of its colonies, as well as those under the control of the defeated Allies, would have been drastically different. The colonial empires of Britain, France, and other European powers were already under increasing strain prior to the war, with nationalistic movements beginning to rise across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The defeat of France and Britain, along with Germany's rise, would likely have delayed or changed the course of many of these uprisings. The dynamics of colonial resistance might have played out less along the lines of straightforward revolutions and more as complex negotiations with a more powerful, possibly more authoritarian, colonial ruler. Under a German-dominated global order, the power dynamics in the colonies would have shifted. German colonial policies, while brutal in some regions, were often more pragmatic in dealing with indigenous populations compared to the British and French. This might have either slowed the momentum of resistance movements or forced them into new forms of collaboration or negotiation with the German Empire. In territories like East Africa or the Pacific Islands, Germany could have focused on more direct control, quelling uprisings with military force, but also offering more economic benefits to the local populations to prevent revolt. At the same time, the shift in European power could have ignited new forms of resistance, particularly in places where nationalist movements were already gaining momentum. In India, for example, Where the British Empire had been under increasing pressure from Indian independence movements, a German-led order might have found it harder to maintain control. Nationalist leaders, inspired by the defeat of Britain, could have shifted their allegiances or intensified their demands for independence. Similarly, in Africa, the rise of Pan-Africanism might have led to more widespread efforts for independence, even in territories under German control. Colonial revolts would also have been impacted by global politics. If Germany was at the helm of the international system, it might have fostered more division between colonial powers, making it easier for revolting colonies to gain external support. This could have accelerated revolts in some regions, as colonial subjects looked to other rising powers for aid, sparking conflicts between former allies and fueling independent struggles that were delayed or suppressed in our timeline. Ultimately, while colonial revolts might have still occurred under a German-led world, the nature of these struggles and their outcomes would have been influenced by a different set of global power relations. The path to independence would have been longer, more fragmented, and defined by new international alliances and rivalries. Could another power challenge Germany? In a world dominated by a victorious Germany, the question of whether another power could challenge its supremacy becomes increasingly important. With Germany's vast territorial holdings, economic strength, and military might, it would seem that it would face little opposition for the foreseeable future. However, history has shown that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invulnerable to challenges from within or beyond its borders. The most likely candidate for challenging Germany's dominance would be the United States. While the U.S. had remained neutral during the early years of World War I, in this alternate reality, its role in global affairs could take a dramatically different shape. If the U.S. remained isolationist, it might not be able to directly challenge Germany on the battlefield, but its economic might could provide a counterbalance, especially through trade and industrial development. Over time, the U.S. could build a more formidable military presence, leveraging its geography and industrial capacity to form a strategic opposition to Germany's ambitions. Another potential challenger could be Japan. As Germany expanded its empire, it is possible that Japan, which had its own imperialist ambitions in the Pacific, might begin to see Germany as a competitor for global influence. Japan's military might and growing naval power could lead to tensions with Germany, particularly in regions like the Far East, where both nations had colonial interests. An arms race in the Pacific or direct confrontations over territory could push Japan into challenging Germany's global position. Soviet Russia under Bolshevik leadership also poses a unique challenge. If the Soviet Union managed to stabilize itself and rebuild after World War I, it could challenge Germany for dominance over Eastern Europe and beyond. The ideological conflict between the Communist Soviet Union and the capitalist German Empire could serve as the backdrop for a potential Cold War-like standoff. The expansionist policies of the Soviet Union might also bring it into direct military conflict with Germany if both sought to exert control over the same territories, particularly in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Lastly, the rise of nationalist movements within Europe, especially in former colonial regions and states under German control, could lead to internal resistance and rebellion. Countries like Italy, or even regions within the newly expanded German territories, might see Germany's imperial rule as a threat to their own sovereignty, leading to uprisings or secessionist movements. If these movements gained enough momentum, they could eventually form the foundation for a challenge to Germany's hegemony. While Germany's power would certainly be overwhelming, the dynamics of global politics, rising powers, and internal unrest could create fertile ground for challenges to its dominance. The world would remain a complex and unstable place, even under the shadow of Germany's victory. The role of ideology in global tensions. In a world dominated by Germany following its victory in World War I, ideology plays a critical role in shaping global tensions and interactions between nations. Ideologies, which encompass beliefs about governance, economics, and the role of the state, become key factors that influence both the internal stability of nations and their external relations. The German Empire, with its authoritarian monarchy, would find itself at odds with other ideological movements that emerged in the 20th century, particularly those advocating for democracy, communism, and national self-determination. One of the most significant ideological tensions would stem from the rise of communism, particularly in the Soviet Union. The Bolshevik Revolution, which had already begun to shake the foundations of Russia, could inspire revolutionary movements across Europe and beyond, challenging Germany's autocratic rule. Communist ideology, with its emphasis on class struggle and the overthrow of capitalist systems, would pose a direct challenge to Germany's political structure. The conflict between capitalist imperialism and communist revolution could manifest as both an ideological and military standoff, with Germany seeking to suppress any spread of communism within its borders and throughout the territories it controlled. At the same time, nationalism could become a powerful counterforce within the German Empire and the colonies it dominated. Nationalist movements, particularly in regions that had long been under foreign rule, would be fueled by the desire for self-determination and independence. These movements would often be ideologically driven, with leaders invoking the principles of freedom, national sovereignty, and identity to rally support for resistance against German rule. In places like Eastern Europe and parts of Africa, the idea of national liberation could be a potent force, leading to uprisings and potentially the fragmentation of the empire. In Western Europe, the ideological tension between democracy and authoritarianism would continue to shape the relationship between Germany and other powers. Germany's autocratic system would be seen as a threat to the democratic ideals of countries like France and Britain. Over time, this ideological divide could lead to the formation of new alliances based on shared values, with democracies aligning against the authoritarian model represented by Germany. In this scenario, the global stage would become increasingly polarized, with the rise of ideological blocs that could fuel further conflicts and competition. The clash of ideologies would not only affect political relations, but also shape cultural and economic exchanges. The global economy could be divided along ideological lines, with capitalist powers seeking to contain communist expansion and authoritarian regimes promoting their own version of order. This ideological competition could thus become a driving force behind both regional and global tensions in a world where Germany's victory shifted the balance of power. Chapter 12: The Modern World in a German Victory Scenario. In a world where Germany emerged victorious in World War I, the course of modern history would be dramatically altered. The geopolitical landscape would be reshaped, with Germany's dominance in Europe paving the way for a different trajectory in global politics, economics, and culture. The ripple effects of a German-led world would transform the 20th century and beyond, leaving a profound impact on international relations and the development of societies across the globe. First and foremost, the continued existence of the German Empire as the central power in Europe would result in a long-lasting period of stability, at least in the heart of the continent. With Germany controlling vast territories, the balance of power in Europe would shift dramatically. The traditional powers of Britain and France would be relegated to secondary roles, their imperial influence waning as they struggled to adapt to the new world order. In this scenario, the German Empire would solidify its position as the dominant force, forming economic, military, and cultural alliances with satellite states across Europe and beyond. The world economy would also evolve differently. Germany's economic policies would shape global trade patterns, with its industrial might and technological advances taking center stage. A German-dominated world might see the development of new global trade routes and economic zones centered around the empire. Germany's focus on technological innovation and infrastructure could lead to an accelerated pace of industrial growth in its sphere of influence, while rival powers like the United States and Russia would be forced to navigate a world where their influence was more limited. Culturally, the influence of German ideals and philosophies would be far-reaching. The arts, literature, and sciences could be dominated by German thought, with leading intellectuals and artists flourishing under the auspices of the empire. The German language could become more widespread, and German culture might become the standard in many parts of Europe and even beyond. However, this cultural expansion would not be without resistance, as nationalist movements in colonized regions and rival powers would fight to preserve their own identities and values. On the global stage, the relationship between Germany and the United States would be especially crucial. Without the intervention of the United States in World War I, America's role in global politics would be significantly diminished. The U.S. might still emerge as an economic powerhouse, but it would not play the central role in shaping the world order that it did after World War II. Instead, the balance of power would tilt firmly toward a Germany that led the charge in reshaping the global system. Ultimately, a German victory would create a vastly different modern world, one where authoritarian rule, industrial might, and imperial ambition would dictate the course of history for generations to come. How would technology evolve differently? In a world shaped by a German victory in World War I, technological advancements would likely take a different path. With Germany at the helm of global power, its industrial and scientific communities would drive innovation in new directions, with an emphasis on military technology, infrastructure development, and scientific research. The outcomes of these shifts would not only influence Germany's empire, but could also affect the entire globe in unexpected ways. The immediate effect of a German-dominated world would be the continued acceleration of industrialization. Germany's commitment to technological innovation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries could result in the expansion of industries such as manufacturing, chemical production, and automotive engineering. By the 1920s, the pace of industrial development would likely be even faster, potentially leading to an earlier and more advanced mechanization of various sectors. Germany's expertise in engineering, seen in innovations like the Zeppelin, might encourage the creation of more advanced transportation systems, such as larger and more efficient trains, as well as innovations in aviation that would take shape far earlier than in our timeline. Militarily, technology would be heavily focused on expanding the German Empire's reach. With the Kaiser's regime firmly in place, there would likely be a continued emphasis on developing advanced weapons and defense systems. Tanks, submarines, and advanced artillery might evolve faster, with the potential for new weapons of mass destruction like chemical warfare being refined more rapidly. The push for technological superiority in military matters would have profound effects on the global balance of power, as other nations sought to either challenge or adopt similar technologies. Science and medicine, too, could follow a distinct trajectory under German leadership. The strong tradition of German research in fields like physics, chemistry, and medicine could give rise to significant breakthroughs in these areas, potentially speeding up the development of antibiotics, medical treatments, and even early computing systems. With the German Empire's vast resources and centralized control, there would be increased state-sponsored support for research and development, with an emphasis on advancing technologies that could solidify Germany's dominance on the world stage. In contrast to the more decentralized scientific landscape of the United States and Britain in our timeline, a German-dominated world might see less international cooperation in technology and more focus on nationalistic achievements. Countries within Germany's sphere of influence would likely adopt German technologies as the standard, leading to more uniform development of industries across Europe and potentially stifling innovation from rival nations. Overall, Technology under a German-dominated world would likely evolve with a strategic focus on enhancing military power, industrial output, and national unity, all while fostering advancements that would further entrench the German Empire's global leadership. The state of human rights and international law. In a world where Germany emerges victorious in World War I, the state of human rights and international law would take a significant shift. With a powerful, centralized German empire at the helm, the norms and structures that have shaped human rights and international relations would be influenced by authoritarian rule, military dominance, and nationalism. The concepts of liberty, democracy, and human dignity might be dramatically different, particularly in the colonies and regions under German control. Under German rule, human rights would be viewed through a more utilitarian lens, with an emphasis on loyalty to the state, obedience to the monarch, and the maintenance of national power. This would have profound implications for civil liberties and political freedoms. While there would likely be legal protections for the elite and those loyal to the empire, ordinary citizens in occupied territories or colonies may experience limited rights or even forced assimilation into German culture and governance. Dissent against the regime would be viewed as treasonous, with harsh penalties for those challenging the authority of the Kaiser. On the international stage, Germany's victory would shape a new order of diplomacy, where international law would be heavily influenced by its priorities. The League of Nations, or any similar body designed to promote peace and cooperation, would likely be dominated by Germany, with little room for the participation of countries that are adversarial to its empire. Any treaties or agreements formed under these circumstances would be skewed in favor of Germany's geopolitical goals, and it is possible that such a body would be more of a tool for enforcing German hegemony than a neutral arbitrator of international disputes. Germany's colonies, which in this alternate reality would be far more expansive, might face stark inequality in terms of legal protections. Indigenous populations in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific would likely face severe restrictions on their autonomy, with many subjected to forced labor or military conscription for the empire's goals. These colonial subjects would have little recourse through international law, as Germany would likely ignore or undermine any attempts at outside intervention. In this new world order, international human rights organizations, which we know today as defenders of individual rights, might not exist, or at the very least, they would be powerless in the face of Germany's military dominance. Instead of global human rights conventions, treaties would likely prioritize strategic and economic considerations, often at the expense of vulnerable populations. The rise of authoritarianism in Germany would fundamentally reshape international law into a system where power dictates the protection of human rights, leaving many nations at the mercy of German imperial interests. Would there be a European Union-like structure? In a world where Germany stands victorious in World War I and reshapes Europe under its imperial rule, the idea of a European Union-like structure would likely take a very different form, if it existed at all. The modern concept of the European Union, built on principles of economic cooperation, democratic governance, and shared sovereignty, would be difficult to reconcile with the centralized, authoritarian nature of a German-led continent. Under a victorious Germany, the structure of Europe would likely be organized around a German-dominated empire, with countries falling into client states or direct colonies. The German Empire, now the most powerful European power, would impose a hierarchical system where the central authority in Berlin controlled major political, economic, and military decisions. Instead of fostering unity through democratic dialogue, as the EU does today, this structure would likely prioritize efficiency, military readiness, and the projection of German power. Smaller or defeated nations, particularly those from the Entente, would have little say in the governance of Europe and might not enjoy the benefits of collective decision-making as seen in the modern EU. The economic ties that exist within the European Union, characterized by free trade and cooperation across borders would be redefined in this alternative reality. While there could be economic agreements between German-controlled regions, they would likely serve Germany's interests first. Instead of a union where nations cooperate as equal members, the relationships between states in a post-victory German Europe would resemble more of an imperial system, where economic resources flow to the empire, and smaller states have little choice but to follow German economic policies. Trade would be dictated by Germany's needs, potentially excluding countries that fail to align with German interests. In terms of political structures, the notion of a European Union with shared governance would be virtually non-existent. National sovereignty would be subjugated to the German monarchy and its authoritarian rule. Countries that would typically be part of a union like the EU today might be absorbed into the empire or relegated to puppet states with little political independence. Any attempts to form alliances between nations that sought to counterbalance German power would be stifled by Germany's military dominance and political control. In essence, a European Union-like structure in a world where Germany emerges victorious would be unrecognizable to us today. It would more likely resemble a collection of dependent territories and regions under the centralized control of the German Empire, with little to no room for the democratic cooperation and shared sovereignty that define the European Union in our current world. Conclusion. In exploring the ramifications of a world where Germany emerges victorious in World War I, we have delved into the profound shifts in political, economic, and social structures that would unfold. The victory of the German Empire would fundamentally alter the course of the 20th century, with far-reaching consequences for Europe, the United States, and global power dynamics. Germany's dominance would reshape Europe into a more rigid, hierarchical system marked by the subjugation of smaller nations and the expansion of German imperial rule. The collapse of the traditional balance of power would open the door for the rise of authoritarian regimes, suppressing the democratic ideals that emerged in the aftermath of the actual World War I. The economic world order would also be heavily influenced by Germany's central role, likely stifling the development of multinational cooperation and global trade alliances like the European Union. The geopolitical consequences of a German victory would reverberate across the globe, affecting not only Europe, but also the United States and Asia. The potential for a German-led world order would strain relationships with emerging powers like the United States, whose position on the global stage would be drastically different under these circumstances. Likewise, the fate of other colonial powers, including Britain and France, would be sealed by their defeat and subjugation to German imperial control. Culturally, the survival of the monarchy and aristocracy within the German Empire would shape societal norms, with the legacy of the ruling elite continuing to exert influence over political and cultural life. The course of social movements, including the advancement of women's rights, would take a divergent path, as the suppression of democratic forces might limit the progress made in these areas. At the heart of this alternate history lies the role of technology, military innovation, and ideological tensions. The trajectory of technological progress, particularly in aviation, naval power, and industrial expansion, would evolve in alignment with German priorities, potentially leading to a different kind of global technological race. Similarly, the tensions between ideologies like fascism and communism would be shaped by the overarching influence of German authoritarianism, and their rise might be stifled or redirected in ways that we cannot fully predict. In conclusion, a world where Germany wins World War I presents a stark contrast to the one we know today. It would not only alter the course of European history, but would also redefine the global order in ways that might limit the spread of democracy, foster new ideologies, and reshape international relationships. It is a world of centralized power, imperial domination, and profound uncertainty about the future of human rights, freedom, and international cooperation.